winter of 1997, risk-taking investors were dying to catch the dot-com wave, and no one wanted in on the action more than 23-year-old Brent Doonan.
I was with one of the big six accounting firms in Chicago right out of college. No complaints with that, but I looked at staying with corporate America or stepping out to carve out my own piece of the American pie.
So in February of 1998, Brent and a friend took a chance and launched a day trading firm in the young, vibrant city of Atlanta. And they knew it was sink or swim.
Day trading was a high-risk game. You could be destitute or deliriously wealthy in a single day.
We were young, ambitious, working 70 hours a week. It was a big risk to go in there and start from the ground up.
Brent knew he needed traders, good traders, with moxie and money. And one day, the perfect candidate came knocking.
A guy named Mark Barton came in and met with me in March of '98. He was a chemist by trade, but he had a lot of trading experience. Called himself a whale, meaning he traded blocks of 3,000 shares at a time, and that he didn't need any training. He was pretty much ready to go.
Brent couldn't help but be impressed by Mark. He was a big, happy-go-lucky, jovial, smart guy.
He knew how to trade, had plenty of money. He wanted to learn how to use our system, and he wanted to get going. Once he started, he was very, very aggressive. The guys in the office nicknamed him the Rocket because he was always just shooting to go to the sky.
One day he netted $106,000 in a single day of trading.
Mark seemed to be just what Alltech needed. He also seemed to be a consummate family man. Once the whistle blew, Mark Barton never socialized.
We would ask Mark, do you want to go to happy hour with us? And his response was typically, I either have church to go to, I've got Cub Scouts or Boy Scouts with my son. He always found an excuse, and it was typically motivated around his family.
So Brent thought it was especially strange when he overheard the guarded phone calls between Mark and his wife.
It was the same every day. He would call up, the phone would ring forever. Finally, an answering machine would come on, and he would say, "It's okay, honey, it's me, it's Mark, you can pick up the phone."
It almost seemed like Mark was regulating his wife's phone calls.
We all have our own quirks. You know, this guy's a great guy. He's handling his gains and losses. He comes in every day with a positive attitude. So he makes his wife wait until she knows that it's him to pick up the phone. I don't really feel as a business owner that I should get into a client's personal life to that level.
Brent knew what his priority was. Mark's performance at Alltech, which was top-notch.
He wasn't going to take no. He was going to keep going. He was going to shoot for the top, hence the name Rocket.
But even an optimistic go-getter has some bad days.
His trading had gotten a little bit out of control. And it's one of those things where you get behind a little bit and you try extra hard to make that up. And that's what happened to him.
But Mark never made it back up. And before long, he had dipped into company reserves to the tune of 11 grand, forcing Brent to cut him off.
I basically told him that he was going to have to make up that difference for us and that he would have to start with at least another $50,000 if he wanted to continue to trade with us.
So Mark left Alltech, but a few weeks later, he came back to make good on his debt.
It wasn't long, given his personality, that he gave us the $11,000 back and funded his account with another $50,000 to get started trading again.
Brent didn't know where Mark got the funds, but he welcomed his return. Unfortunately, the Rocket was still off course. And within 8 weeks, Mark owed Alltech again, this time more than $30,000.
Brent again asked Mark to leave Alltech. Barton said he understood, and maybe it was time for him to get back to work at being a chemist.
There were no hard feelings. There was a handshake and a vow that he would be back someday to repay the debt.
But 2 months went by with no word from Mark and no payment. Then on July 29, 1999, while Brent was in the conference room holding a meeting, the rocket suddenly appeared.
Mark Barton came through the main doors at All-Tech, a little bit sweaty, and he began waving to get Brent's attention.
Mark said, come here, you're really gonna love this. Smile on his face. I thought he was there to repay the $30,000 that he was in debt to us. I followed him out of the conference room and into my office, where my partner and my secretary were both seated. When he turned around, that happy, jovial look on his face was gone. It was just this straight-faced with these eyes that just seemed to look right through me. And he said simply, today is going to be visual.
Today is going to be visual. At that point, Mark crossed his arms like some B-movie bandito, and he pulls out 2 handguns.
At first, Brent thought Mark was pranking him.
I thought maybe they were cap guns or something, and then I saw the flash muzzle.
And he fires point blank at Brent, looking him in the eye the whole time.
The first one hit me in the chest, the second one in the arm. I laid there for a couple seconds and was in intense pain. I started to see a pool of blood surround me, and I saw 2 gold shell casings right there. At that point, I just said to myself, oh my God, I just got shot.
And Barton was just getting started. While Brent lay there in agony, Mark shot Brent's partner and assistant, then continued onto the floor.
Mark began shooting methodically, yelling at one point, I hope this doesn't ruin your trading day.
There was blood all over. I could hear him out there shooting people over and over and over, the screaming, the yelling, the commotion. I thought, do I lay there and pretend like I'm dead? Do I get up and try to make a run for it? There was a high probability that if I laid there and played dead, that he would come back and finish me off. So I stood up, and at that point I realized that he was in my office doorway with his back towards me, shooting out onto the office trading floor. I decided very quickly that I didn't have a choice, that if he turned around, I would be dead. My only option was to go for it. He had the gun aimed right at the woman's head, and I hit him as hard as I possibly could. And he pulled the trigger. It missed her. I made a run for it into the hallway, but he was able to shoot me in the back, in my left arm, and one that was just a grazer.
By now, Brent had been shot 5 times.
By the time I got into the hallway and started to make a run for it, it was a very surreal experience. The walls seemed to be closing in. I was trying to run as fast as I could, but it seemed like I was just not making headway, almost like when you're running in a dream. I was having a hard time standing, so I was using the walls to keep my balance. The lights were very bright. I couldn't hear a thing. I was just on a mission, an instinct of survival. Just get out of there. I didn't know what was going on behind me, if he was still in the office, if he was still in the building.
Just ahead was a service elevator in the hallway.
Brent knew the elevator was his one shot at escape.
I just started pushing the up button as fast as I could, just pushing. And a few seconds went by. I noticed one of our other traders, and right behind her, I saw him lift his gun and shoot her right there, point blank. At that point, the service elevator doors open. I jumped in there, started frantically pushing buttons.
Brent prayed for the doors to close.
I was just trying to go somewhere, anywhere.
But his attacker had other plans.
Barton appeared outside the elevator.
He raised his gun at me.
The monster was inches away.
On July 29th of 1999, young executive Brent Doonan boarded an elevator, but he wasn't headed to a meeting. He was trying to escape Mark Barton's deadly massacre after being shot 5 times.
I jumped in there, started frantically pushing buttons, and as the door started to close, it was Barton. He raised his gun at me. And just before he pulled the trigger, the elevator doors closed. I crouched down on all fours, just trying to keep some energy left to where when the doors opened, I had a fighting chance. Eventually, they opened in what felt like an eternity. I had only traveled up one floor to the third floor. I saw an office right next to the elevator.
The tenants on the third floor had no idea of the carnage going on below them.
I walked in there and I said, "Somebody please help me. I've been shot." And the response was, "Is this a joke?" I instructed them to lock the door and close the blinds and to get me out of the entryway, that it was likely that the shooter was still after me and that if he found me, we were all going to die.
Brent was dead serious and fading fast.
And that's when I fell to the ground.
While some of the office workers tended to Brent's wounds, others called 911, and the dispatcher assured them that help was on the way.
Help was on the way, but what no one knew was that it was being funneled somewhere else.
As horrifying as the events were at Alltech, the slaughter hadn't started there. Barton had actually begun his killing across Piedmont Avenue at Momentum Securities, where he had also lost money. The dispatchers had confused Alltech with Momentum Securities.
A terrible waiting game began for Brent as EMTs frantically tried to figure out where to go.
Brent was dying. As he lay bleeding on the floor, he asked someone to call his brother.
They were able to get him on the line. The phone cord would not reach, so the gal that was on the phone was relaying from my brother to me. He was saying, "Don't you die on me. You're a fighter. You're a champion. You keep going." One of the women in the office held my hand and started praying the Our Father over and over. My mouth was filling with blood. At that point, I had made a promise to myself that I didn't care how long that it took. I was in a severe amount of pain, but I was going to stay awake and I was going to fight as hard as I could. At that point, I was at peace with the situation and decided I was just going to hang on again and hope to last till the paramedics arrived.
Brent lay there for almost an hour, fearing Mark Barton could still rush in to finish him off.
The door burst open, and in came a paramedic and a man behind him. He said, "If you keep your eyes open and on me, you will live today."
When I first heard about it, I couldn't believe that my son had been shot. There are no words that can describe what a mother feels like to know that their child was hurting so bad. There's just no words.
As he was rushed to the hospital, Brent focused on the man's face, while police turned their sights on finding Mark Barton, whose body count was rising.
Between Alltech and Momentum, Mark Barton had shot 22 people. 9 of them died.
Worse, in the confusion of 2 shooting locations, the murderer slipped away.
Mark Barton had escaped the Alltech offices and walked across the parking lot and gotten into his minivan, disappeared into the streets of Atlanta. One of the largest manhunts in Georgia history locked down Atlanta and much of the state.
And that's when police went to Mark Barton's home and found another ghastly tableau.
They found the bludgeoned bodies of his wife and his 2 children, killed by a hammer in their beds.
As the manhunt intensified, Brent Doonan lay in a hospital bed, fighting for his life. The city of Atlanta was on high alert, with residents and officers alike terrified of who Mark Barton would target next.
The city was scared to death.
He was an explosive psychopath.
They didn't know how much ammunition he had. It was like a nightmare.
In July of 1999, 4 horrifying hours passed after Atlanta police had locked down the state and launched a fierce manhunt for heavily armed killer Mark Barton.
The whole city was just frightened to death. They didn't know how much ammunition he had. The news was on all the TVs in Atlanta. It was a horrible, horrible nightmare.
Finally, police cornered Barton at a gas station north of town and ordered him out of his van. Seconds later, a shot rang out.
Rather than be arrested, Mark Barton shot himself in the head.
Mark Barton died instantly. The nightmare was finally over.
I was so relieved when I found out that Mark killed himself. And we didn't have to worry whether he was going to pop up around the corner somewhere. I felt a huge relief that he was gone.
But Mark's suicide left behind many unanswered questions and several victims, including Brent Doonan, fighting for their lives.
He'd lost most of his body's blood supply, and most of his internal organs had been damaged.
It was devastating. When we arrived at the hospital, he was hooked up to all kinds of tubes. They told us that they didn't think that he would make it through the night.
Against all odds, Brent made it to the next morning, and that's when his family told him that Mark was dead.
I doubted whether they were telling me the truth or just trying to get me to keep fighting, so I asked one family member after another until I was satisfied that he was no longer after me.
But after relief, the realization of what had happened seemed unbearable.
You've made it, and you go through all these questions as to, why was it me? Why did I get through it, and why did this person die?
Brent racked his mind for any clues he might have missed.
You start looking back at signs to see what was out of the ordinary.
When he heard Mark killed his own wife and children, Brent remembered Mark's calls to his wife.
If I could find anything odd about him, it would be the way he dealt with his wife.
And as more information about who Mark Barton really was slowly came out, Brent and everyone else realized Mark's happy-go-lucky smile was hiding sinister secrets.
He was just not the person that I thought he was.
Just 6 years earlier, Mark had secretly taken out a life insurance policy on his first wife.
Not much later, his wife and her mother were found brutally bludgeoned to death in a camper trailer. Barton was the main suspect, but he was never arrested.
Forensics couldn't make a conclusive link, and Barton remained free and completely unapologetic. He cashed in on the policy and invested in the stock market.
The $150,000 that he had used in day trading was the result of insurance funds from the passing away of his first wife.
But Mark racked up more debt than income and ended up owing thousands, not just to Alltech, but also to Momentum Securities.
Mark Barton was caught in a downward spiral. Things had gotten out of his control. That might have something to do with his explosion of frustration at the end. He was lashing out at the world. Unfortunately, we'll never know exactly what was on Mark Barton's mind.
Mark Barton's motives died with him. When it came to matters of the heart, Donna Kohler was a bit of a late bloomer.
In high school, I was kind of a loner and didn't date, didn't have a lot of friends, didn't go out and do a lot of things.
As an 18-year-old college freshman in Cape Girardeau, Missouri, Donna had never been in love. But she hoped that would change.
I was hoping not only to get my degree, but to meet somebody and end up in a relationship.
In the winter of 1970, Donna's wish was granted. One evening at a college party, she found something much more interesting than books to study. His name was Jim Bowley, a handsome student 2 years Donna's senior.
I sat down next to him in the living room and we started talking. He was going for his teaching degree, as was I, and it was just real easy, real comfortable to talk to him.
I think it was their love of being an educator that brought them together. They pretty much were inseparable from that point forward.
He had a great sense of humor. He had beautiful, short, brown, wavy hair and real pretty hazel eyes and just nice-looking guy.
Donna and Jim fell hard and fast, and by the following fall, there was no doubt the lovebirds were made for each other. In the summer of 1972, Donna and Jim married in a beautiful Catholic church.
I had no doubts. This was the man I wanted to be with, and I was ready to spend the rest of my life with him.
After the wedding, the newlyweds set about building their lives together in Sikeston, Missouri. Jim started teaching sixth grade history, and in 1975, Donna landed a teaching job of her own. 1 year later, the couple welcomed baby Steve into the world. And while Donna was overjoyed, she was also overwhelmed.
Being a mother and having a full-time job would get to be a little much, taking care of the baby, taking care of the laundry, and then trying to get supper started at the same time.
But Jim, ever the perfect husband, had a solution.
Jim offered to go ahead and do the cooking, and that was a big load off my mind because then I wouldn't have to worry about getting the food on the table.
By the time the couple had their second son in October 1979, Donna and Jim were well into the swing of things on the home front. But at work, Jim felt stifled by his lack of upward mobility. So in the fall of 1987, when he found a job as a middle school guidance counselor in St. Louis, a move seemed like the perfect plan.
I was really happy because my parents still lived up here, and it was nice to know that I was going to be close to them.
Donna knew she couldn't have asked for a better partner than Jim. But over the next 6 years, their perfect life together would become tainted. And Donna would learn that the most important decision of her life would also be the most lethal. On the morning of September 25th, 1993, Donna woke knowing something was seriously wrong.
I could just hardly move. I was extremely weak, and I was turning jaundiced and just felt horrible. I just really felt like I was dying.
Jim rushed Donna to the hospital.
Jim brought a wheelchair out, and I got into the wheelchair, and the last thing I remember was going through the hospital doors.
Everyone knew that Donna's situation was grave, but no one realized that things were about to get even worse.
Something was not right. I was scared.
At that point, my whole life fell apart.
In the fall of 1987, 6 years before Donna Kohler was fighting for her life, she and her husband Jim Boley and their 2 sons moved to St. Louis to further Jim's education career. But Jim's job as a school counselor brought new responsibilities.
Jim's new teaching job kept him away from home a lot because he did some coaching with baseball and football.
Her husband was a busy man, but that didn't bother Donna one bit.
It was bringing in money, and we had a lot of bills to pay. It really didn't hurt our marriage. We were both very happy, and things just seemed to flow real nicely.
In fact, as Jim turned 40, Donna noticed that he seemed friskier than ever.
He started to let his hair grow longer. He went out and bought colored underwear and bought a sports car convertible. I didn't know if it was the midlife crisis or what it was, but I was enjoying it.
But there was something Donna wasn't enjoying. In the summer of 1991, her health started going downhill.
I thought I was coming down with a sinus infection. My stomach just didn't feel good. Then it progressed to where I was having stomach cramps and throwing up, and I just didn't know what was going on. I first went to my regular doctor, and he gave me antibiotics.
When antibiotics didn't help, doctors concluded irritable bowel syndrome might be causing Donna's debilitating stomach pain.
When my doctor gave me a diagnosis, I felt relieved. And I thought, okay, we've got a name to what I have. We've got pills to help me. I can work with this.
And Jim was the perfect nurse when the pain was at its worst.
Jim would be very attentive. He would always want to try to fix me something to eat that I could keep down, and was always taking care of me.
He would prepare all her food for her and all her meals. And whenever she would be in a lot of pain, he would say, "Oh, sweetie, I'm sorry that you feel so bad. Let me go make you something to eat."
As the school year wound down, it seemed Donna's symptoms did too. Until the summer of 1992, when Donna became ill once again while gearing up for a new school year.
My symptoms had come back even stronger. So I went to my gynecologist to see if maybe there was something else going on that I didn't know about.
And sure enough, Donna's gynecologist found a large cyst on one of her ovaries. He recommended surgery to remove it, and Donna scheduled the procedure. But she found herself in the hospital sooner than planned.
Right before I was supposed to have the surgery, I got seriously ill. My fever spiked to 105. I got delirious. Jim took me to the hospital, and they ended up packing my body in ice to try to bring my fever down. I lost consciousness. When I woke up, I lost 2 days. The doctors weren't quite sure what had happened to me.
It seemed surgery was still Donna's best option, but the procedure did not go well. While doctors were able to remove the cyst, Donna suffered an unexpected reaction to the anesthesia and ended up on life support.
I was terrified. I was afraid she was going to die.
For 10 days, Donna's life hung in the balance, while doctors conducted test after test, including a heavy metal screening for poison, but the results were negative.
The doctors didn't know what was causing it.
But miraculously, Donna's health improved quickly in her doctor's care, and she was released from the hospital on October 23rd. But just as those problems were subsiding, new ones were brewing at home.
I'd been home from the hospital for about 3 or 4 days, and I was home alone. Jim was at school, kids were at school, and I got a call from a woman, and she would not give her name.
Instead, the woman gave Donna some devastating news about Jim.
I was hysterical, and I just knew that there was no way that that could be him.
The more I learned, the more I realized I didn't really know my father.
In the fall of 1992, a few days after her discharge from the hospital, Donna Kohler was hoping her troubles were over, until she received a disturbing phone call from a strange woman.
She told me that my husband was running around with a woman, and I told her that she didn't know what she was talking about.
But the woman insisted she was telling the truth. She told Donna to check a telephone dating service where Jim had created an ad.
When I listened to the message, it was Jim saying that he was an ivory man looking for an ebony woman. And I just lost it. I slammed the phone down, started crying, called my mom. I was hysterical. I didn't know what to do.
When Jim got home from work, Donna immediately cornered him.
I looked at him and I said, "We have to talk." And I told him about hearing that message. And the first thing out of his mouth was, "Oh, is that thing still on?"
Jim quickly admitted that he had created the ad, but he had done it as a favor for a coworker.
He said, "You know the other counselor at school, how he's got the speech impediment." He said he wanted to put a message on the dating service, but he didn't want to use his voice, so I offered to put the message on for him.
The explanation made sense. Donna had met the coworker with the speech impediment, so it was plausible he'd asked Jim for help with the ladies.
Jim told me he was sorry that I had to hear that and that he would take that off immediately. He said, "I'm really sorry, and I would never do anything to hurt you."
Donna decided to let the matter go. She had other things on her mind. Her health had begun to go downhill again.
It didn't take too long for me to start having the same symptoms that I had been having, and I was scared.
Nobody knew what was wrong with her. I was confused to watch my mother going through what she was going through. It was a very painful experience.
At their wits' end, Donna's doctors suspected lupus might be the culprit and prescribed new medication. Although she was in agony, Donna felt lucky to have true love on her side.
Jim was still very attentive. He would still come home and try to fix me something that I could eat, and was always loving and caring for me.
Still, despite Jim's TLC, Donna continued getting sicker with each passing day.
I was not able to keep anything down. So he gave me a glass of milk, and when I got done drinking it, it had like pink residue in the bottom of the glass. And he said, "Well, that's that discount milk. You know it gets like that sometimes." I never remembered my milk being pink, but I was so out of it.
On September 25th, 1993, Donna woke feeling worse than ever.
I just felt that I was dying. I was extremely weak. I couldn't keep any food down. And I was turning jaundiced and just felt horrible.
Donna begged Jim to take her to the hospital, but Jim suggested Donna wait for her lupus meds to kick in.
So I called my mom, and I told her that Jim didn't want to take me to the hospital. And she said, "If he isn't going to take you, I will."
The threat worked. Jim finally rushed his sick wife to the hospital. Once there, Donna fell into a fit of seizures. Her heart stopped between 5 and 7 times. Doctors were able to bring her back, but the prognosis was grave. Donna couldn't speak, and she was now paralyzed from the nose down.
She had all these tubes hooked up to her. She was on a ventilator. She couldn't move. She was unconscious. I had a hard time being in the room seeing her like that.
When I woke up and I realized that I was paralyzed, I didn't know if I was ever going to have my life back. I would lay there in the bed and try to move my arm. And my brain was telling me that my arm was moving, but it wasn't moving.
Doctors were baffled, but everything was about to change. It all started with one of Donna's nurses.
I was charge nurse that evening, and by the end of the night, Donna was critical. And I usually didn't go down to the MRI with them, but she was so critical at this time that I decided to go down with her.
While Donna waited on a gurney in the hallway, Juanita went back to Donna's hospital room for her chart.
Jim was in the room. He was talking on the phone.
And what Juanita overheard him say was jaw-dropping.
I was shocked. You remember standing there, did I really hear that?
I figured there were 2 options available. One, attempted suicide, or 2, attempted murder.
In the fall of 1993, Donna Kohler was at death's door. The situation was dire, and doctors had no idea what was wrong with her. Until one day that September, when an attentive nurse overheard a shocking phone call.
Jim was talking on the phone. He was talking in sexually explicit conversation with somebody on the other line. It was just disgusting, especially when your wife is dying. And then I overheard him say arsenic. I was shocked. I remember standing there, did I really hear that?
Arsenic is a poison commonly found in pesticides. In humans, it can cause a breakdown of normal bodily functions.
It was like the perfect storm, and everything came together. I talked to the supervisor, and I was told, you need to be sure about what you heard. You know, you can be sued, get your license taken away.
But Juanita was certain of what she had heard. She informed Donna's doctors immediately.
I couldn't live with myself if she died.
Doctors quickly issued another heavy metal screening, this time from Donna's hair, and the results were staggering.
It was like 7 to 10 times the lethal amount of arsenic that was eventually found in her system.
Doctors moved Donna to a secure section of the hospital and immediately called the police.
The hospital told me that Donna was paralyzed from the neck down and not able to speak. So I figured there were two options available. One, attempted suicide, or two, attempted murder.
Police were able to question Donna using a letterboard where she blinked one letter at a time.
She started crying and was very upset, and that's when she told me that she thought Jim was involved, that he had given her milk with a pink residue in it.
Investigators immediately brought Jim in for questioning, but he denied everything.
He said she was having hallucinations. He would always redirect blame. He would always try to change the subject.
Convinced Jim wasn't telling the truth, detectives hammered him. But when Jim finally broke, he told police another whopper.
Jim finally admitted his guilt, but even during his admission, he tried to make it nice. He said he poisoned her with the arsenic just to make her sick. His intent, according to him, was to make Donna sick so she'd stay home from work, and then he could stay home and they could have some quality time together. I thought it was a bunch of bull.
In fact, as detectives dug deeper, they discovered that the respected school counselor and sports coach was leading a double life.
He had safe deposit box in his name, a cell phone in his name. He stayed at hotels under assumed names, used 2 different dating sites to date different women. When she was sick, he'd be with someone else, checking into a motel. It was obvious that he wasn't concerned about Donna. He had $600,000 in life insurance on her.
My whole life fell apart. I realized that all of this illness had been caused by my husband, and he was the one that was always taking care of me. He was the one that I trusted. It just really upset me that our whole marriage was a lie.
On October 10th, 1993, police arrested Jim Boley and charged him with first-degree assault and armed criminal action. In January 1995, Jim Boley went to trial, and Donna testified against him.
I made sure that I looked at him. I wanted him to see that I had made it. And I wanted him to see that I was going to put him away.
On February 1st, a jury found Jim Boley guilty as charged. He received 2 consecutive life sentences. Jim showed no remorse. And after the trial, Donna's divorce from her husband was final.
I often wonder what part of our marriage was really true. Was there any love? Or did this start at the very beginning? He was just going to stay married, have a couple kids, and then try to get rid of me.
Today, after a long road of rehab and therapy, Donna can walk, talk, and teach once again.
I would tell my students that they were not allowed to use the word can't in my room, because if I had stopped anywhere along the way and said, I can't do this, I wouldn't be where I am today.
She'll never be able to have the fine motor control skills that she had before the poisoning. And I think that her living is the best revenge that she could possibly ever get on him.
And even though it took years for Donna to rebuild her faith in men, she's since found happiness with a new husband.
I've been married 11 years, and my marriage is strong. I still enjoy going out and doing karaoke. I can still dance. I've gotten to be a pretty good cook now that I'm doing it on my own.
There is a certain expectation of peace when one stands before a building dedicated to the administration of justice. In any society, a courthouse is designed to be the ultimate sanctuary of order, a place where the chaotic and often violent grievances of the outside world are brought to be disassembled, analyzed, and resolved through the sterile and absolute mechanics of the law. The High Court of American Samoa, situated in the village of Fagatogo, is no exception to this universal rule. It stands as a physical manifestation of authority, a structural promise that conflicts will be settled not by the primitive dictates of force, but by the measured scales of justice. On the island, this building is a cornerstone of societal equilibrium. It is where lines are drawn between right and wrong, where the community looks for definitive answers to its most painful disputes. Yet, the solemnity of this promise makes the shattering of it all the more devastating. When the sanctuary of law is violated, the resulting trauma extends far beyond the immediate victims. It tears at the very fabric of the community's sense of security and exposes the terrifying vulnerabilities of the systems we trust to protect us. The island's setting and the court. Fagatogo is a place where the deep blue of the Pacific Ocean meets lush, dramatic landscapes. American Samoa itself is a territory characterized by its tightly knit communities, where extended families and deep-rooted traditions form the core of daily existence. In such a society, a dispute is rarely just an isolated incident between two individuals. It is often a complex web of familial loyalties, historical grievances, and collective honor. Everyone knows everyone else, or at the very least, knows of their lineage and their family ties. This interconnectedness is usually a source of immense strength and cultural pride, fostering a profound sense of belonging. However, when conflicts arise, this same closeness can act as a dangerous pressure cooker. The emotional stakes are magnified exponentially because the opposing parties are not anonymous strangers in a sprawling metropolis. They are neighbors, they are familiar faces, they are people who share the same small, isolated geography. The High Court in Fagatogo frequently becomes the arena where these intense, localized pressures are brought to a head, channeled into the formal procedures of a trial in the fragile hope of finding a peaceful, legally binding resolution. The day of the verdict. The date was July 22, 2010. By all outward appearances, it was meant to be a day of closure. Inside the High Court, a highly charged criminal trial was reaching its inevitable conclusion. The case at hand involved a severe allegation of assault. For the duration of the trial leading up to this moment, the courtroom had served as a container for the palpable animosity radiating from the two distinct factions involved in the case. On one side sat the family and supporters of the victim of the assault, carrying the heavy burden of their trauma and a desperate, unwavering demand for retribution. On the other side sat the family of the accused, equally steadfast in their defense and hoping for exoneration. The wooden benches of the gallery were essentially divided by an invisible but impenetrable wall of hostility. The air inside the courtroom was thick, not just with the tropical heat typical of the region, but with an agonizing psychological tension. Every glance across the aisle was laden with unspoken threats, and every shift in posture carried the weight of a brewing storm. The legal process is designed to be dispassionate, to strip away the raw emotion of a crime and present it as a clinical set of facts to be evaluated. But for the families sitting in that room, there was absolutely nothing clinical about it. This was a matter of blood, honor, and survival. Lieutenant Lucilla Brown, tasked with maintaining the fragile order in this highly volatile environment, was Lieutenant Lucilla Brown of the local police force. Standing guard in the High Court, Lieutenant Brown was the human embodiment of the law's authority. In the emotionally charged atmosphere of a courtroom waiting for a verdict, the presence of a uniformed officer is meant to be a deterrent, a visual reminder that no matter what emotions are swirling in the gallery, the rules of society must be respected at all costs. Lieutenant Brown was not just a spectator to the unfolding legal drama. He was the primary shield between the civilized proceedings of the court and the potential for explosive, uncontrollable violence. He monitored the crowd, his eyes scanning the tense faces of the rival families, anticipating any sudden movements or outbursts that could derail the process. His job was to project absolute calm, to command respect without speaking a word, and to ensure that the transition from the reading of the verdict to the exiting of the building was as orderly as possible. He stood proudly as a protector, an unwavering guardian of the judicial process. The vulnerability of the law. However, beneath the commanding presence of his uniform lay a stark, terrifying vulnerability, a reality dictated by the specific, deeply ironic legal framework of American Samoa at that time. In the year 2010, the laws governing the territory mandated that regular patrol officers and those conducting standard duties, including courtroom security, were strictly prohibited from carrying firearms. This was a policy rooted in a specific philosophy of community policing, an ideology that prioritized approachability, mutual respect, and trust over the militarization of law enforcement. It was a belief that in a small, tight-knit island community, an armed police force might create an unnecessary barrier of fear between the authorities and the public. The badge and the uniform were supposed to be enough. The authority vested in the officer by the state was theoretically expected to command enough respect to quell any disturbance. But this philosophy, no matter how noble in its intentions or peaceful in its design, created a fatal, devastating asymmetry when confronted with raw, unhinged criminal intent. Lieutenant Brown, a veteran officer tasked with separating two bitterly divided families at the climax of an emotional trial, was entirely unarmed. He was standing on the front lines of a deeply personal war, equipped with nothing more than his uniform, his extensive training, and his bare hands. He was a man asked to enforce the peace in a situation where the peace was rapidly disintegrating, fundamentally unprotected against the ultimate form of lethal violence. The climax of the trial. The pivotal moment arrived when the judge prepared to deliver the verdict. The entire courtroom held its collective breath. The legal machinery had ground through the evidence, the testimonies, and the arguments, and now the final judgment was ready to be pronounced to the silent gallery. The words, when they finally echoed through the heavy air of the room, were devastating to one side of the aisle: not guilty. The accused in the brutal assault case was acquitted, clear of the charges by the rigorous legal standards of the court. The proceedings had concluded, officially finalizing the exoneration. For the family of the accused, it was a moment of immense relief, a profound vindication that washed away the paralyzing anxiety of the trial. But for the family of the assault victim, those two words were a catastrophic, life-altering blow. The verdict was not perceived as a triumph of objective justice, but as a gross, intolerable miscarriage of it. In an instant, the formal structure of the court lost all its meaning and authority for them. The legal system had failed to validate their immense pain, failed to punish the person they believed was undeniably responsible for their suffering. The simmering tension that had been carefully contained throughout the proceedings instantly transformed into a boiling, uncontrollable rage. The invisible wall dividing the gallery completely shattered. The breaking point. The immediate aftermath of an acquittal in a highly emotional case is always the most dangerous, unpredictable phase. The formal boundaries of the trial dissolve, and the opposing sides are forced to rise, turn, and walk out of the building together. The structure of the courtroom, which had forced them to sit in silence and listen to authority, now required them to move, to navigate the aisles and the doors in close, agonizing proximity to their enemies. As the reality of the not guilty verdict fully sank in, the aggrieved family members began to move aggressively toward the exit. The bitter disappointment morphed rapidly into a dark, visceral anger. It was no longer just about the initial, painful assault. It was about the perceived betrayal by the justice system itself. Among the crowd of exiting family members was one individual whose fury had completely overridden any remaining sense of reason, logic, or societal restraint. For this person, the legal avenue for retribution had been permanently closed, and so they made the immediate catastrophic decision to open a new, extrajudicial one. The civilized veneer of the legal proceedings was completely and utterly abandoned in favor of raw vengeance. The unseen threat. Lieutenant Brown, recognizing the extreme volatility of the moment, took up his position near the exit, guiding the volatile crowds out of the high court and attempting to maintain a semblance of professional order. He was an experienced officer, likely accustomed to the loud, angry outbursts that often accompany highly controversial verdicts. He was prepared to handle raised voices, perhaps even intervene in minor physical scuffles. He was there to ensure that the families dispersed into the daylight without further incident. He stood firmly in his uniform, representing the steady, unyielding presence of the law in the face of emotional chaos. But as the crowd spilled out from the courtroom and into the lobby and the entrance of the High Court, the situation spiraled completely out of his control, bypassing any predictable or manageable escalation. He could not have known that within the surging crowd of angry, profoundly disappointed people, a lethal weapon had been brought into the immediate vicinity. He could not have anticipated that a disgruntled member of the victim's family, absolutely consumed by the perceived injustice of the acquittal, was actively reaching for a concealed handgun with the intent to kill. The illusion of safety. The unparalleled tragedy of that day lies deeply in the stark contrast between the environment and the action that was about to unfold. Here was the High Court of American Samoa, an imposing structure designed to project safety, absolute fairness, and the unwavering rule of law. Here was an officer of the law, standing faithfully on duty, fulfilling his lifelong commitment to protect and serve his community. And yet, the system had placed him in that crucial, highly dangerous position without the necessary, fundamental tools to defend his own life, let alone the lives of the innocent bystanders swarming around him. The well-intentioned policy that stripped him of a firearm left him tragically exposed to the very worst, most violent impulses of humanity. As the angry mob moved aggressively through the doors, the aggrieved individual drew their weapon, preparing to unleash terror. The transition from a formal legal proceeding to a chaotic, bloody crime scene happened in a fraction of a second. The sanctity of the courthouse was about to be violated in the most profound and horrifying way imaginable. Lieutenant Lucilla Brown, a brave but unarmed guardian of justice, was about to come face to face with the ultimate, fatal failure of the system he faithfully served. The hollow echoes of the not guilty verdict were about to be permanently drowned out by the deafening, horrific sound of gunfire. The delicate line between civilization and barbarism, which the court was explicitly built to maintain, was completely erased, leaving only the terrifying, unforgettable reality of an unarmed man standing bravely against a loaded gun. To truly comprehend the magnitude of the tragedy that befell the High Court of American Samoa on that fateful day in July, one must first immerse themselves in the profound uniqueness of the setting itself, understanding the complex cultural and social dynamics that define this remote territory. American Samoa is not merely a distant dot on a map. It is a deeply woven, intricate tapestry of ancient Polynesian traditions operating concurrently alongside modern American legal frameworks. Nestled in the heart of the vast South Pacific Ocean, the islands are characterized by their breathtaking, dramatic natural beauty, with jagged emerald volcanic peaks plunging sharply into the relentless, azure expanse of the sea. However, the true, enduring strength of American Samoa lies not in its stunning geography, but intrinsically in its people. Society here is fundamentally governed by Fa Samoa, the Samoan way, which is a deeply ingrained, almost sacred cultural code that emphasizes the absolute, paramount importance of extended family, complex kinship networks, and a profound, unwavering respect for elders and established authority figures. In this tightly knit environment, the concept of the individual is inevitably and deeply intertwined with the collective identity of the family unit. An insult, an injury, or a perceived injustice suffered by one single person is never viewed as an isolated, individual event. Rather, it is a grievance felt deeply and passionately by the entire extended network of relatives. This intense, interconnected social fabric creates a community of remarkable, unmatched resilience and mutual support, where neighbors consistently look out for one another and the bonds of shared lineage are treated as sacred. Yet, this exact same closeness also inherently dictates that conflicts, when they do inevitably arise, carry a unique, heavy, and potentially explosive emotional weight. Disputes within this community are rarely just simple, easily resolved disagreements. They are heavily laden with generations of historical context, deeply entrenched family honor, and the intense, unavoidable emotional stakes that come from living in a small, geographically isolated community where complete anonymity is entirely impossible to achieve. At the very center of this complex, intertwined social and legal dynamic lies the village of Fagatogo, functioning as the vital governmental and judicial heart of the entire territory. Prominently situated within Fagatogo stands the High Court building, a structure of immense symbolic and practical importance to the island's residents. The High Court represents the physical intersection where the ancient, unwritten, deeply felt rules of FA Samoa are forced to meet the codified, rigid, and clinical statutes of the modern American legal system. For the people of the island, this imposing building serves as the ultimate, final arbiter of deeply entrenched disputes that cannot be peacefully settled through traditional village councils, local chiefs, or intense family negotiations. When a conflict escalates to the severe point of entering the formal halls of the High Court, it clearly signifies that the community is seeking an absolute, definitive, and legally binding resolution enforced by the supreme power of the state. The architecture and the atmosphere of the court itself are deliberately designed to project an aura of unyielding authority, absolute neutrality, and solemnity, standing in stark, deliberate contrast to the informal, highly emotional, and familial nature of everyday island life. Citizens enter this building with a deeply ingrained sense of reverence and trepidation, fully understanding that the legal decisions formulated within its heavy walls possess the terrifying power to alter the course of lives, restore damaged honor, or plunge entire families into profound, long-lasting despair. The court is theoretically intended to serve as a neutral, sterile battleground, an environment where logic, precedent, and hard evidence are supposed to completely override and suppress the passionate, chaotic, and often volatile emotions of the outside world. It is a hallowed place where the community places its fragile, collective trust, desperately believing that the structured, objective process of the law will ultimately lead to a fair, balanced, and just conclusion, thereby preserving the delicate, underlying social harmony of the island territory. Operating effectively within this highly pressurized, culturally complex environment, the role of a local police officer is extraordinarily demanding, incredibly nuanced, and requires a deeply specialized skill set. It requires far more than just the mechanical, blind enforcement of written statutes. It demands a profound, intimate, and constantly evolving understanding of the community, its subtle cultural undercurrents, and the incredibly delicate, ever-shifting balance of local family dynamics. Police Lieutenant Lucilla Brown embodied the absolute very best of these crucial, indispensable qualities. Achieving the esteemed rank of lieutenant within the American Samoa Police Force is not merely a matter of passing standardized exams or passively accumulating years on the force. It is a powerful testament to an officer's accumulated, hard-earned wisdom, their deeply established respect within the community, and their proven, consistent ability to successfully navigate the complex, often turbulent waters of local island life. Lieutenant Brown was never viewed as a faceless, anonymous enforcer of a distant state apparatus. He was a highly recognizable, deeply familiar, and profoundly respected presence to the people of Fagatogo and the surrounding villages. He was a seasoned man who fundamentally understood that behind every single criminal complaint filed, behind every heated neighborhood dispute, and behind every high-stakes court case, there existed complex webs of fragile human relationships and deeply felt, raw emotions. His functional authority on the streets and in the courthouse did not stem solely from the metal badge pinned precisely to his chest, but rather from the quiet, commanding dignity with which he consistently carried himself and the massive reservoir of accumulated trust he had meticulously built over many long years of dedicated, unwavering public service. He was universally known and respected for his naturally calm demeanor, his incredibly steady presence during times of crisis, and his unwavering, passionate commitment to maintaining the peace and stability in a beloved community he both deeply cherished and intimately understood. For a seasoned veteran like Lieutenant Brown, the daily reality of policing was essentially a continuous, high-stakes exercise in advanced diplomacy, psychological profiling, and rapid de-escalation. In a tight-knit, closed society where everyone inevitably knows everyone else's business and lineage, relying on heavy-handed, aggressive physical tactics is rarely effective and is often severely counterproductive, risking the ignition of broader community outrage. An effective officer in this unique setting must possess the exceptionally rare ability to command total, unquestioned respect without unnecessarily inciting anger or defiance, to firmly and resolutely enforce the law while remaining deeply, consistently sensitive to the overriding cultural imperative of preserving individual dignity and family face. Lieutenant Brown excelled remarkably in this highly delicate, unforgiving art of island law enforcement. He knew the warring families intimately. He knew the long, complicated histories of their grievances, and he fundamentally understood the immense, crushing weight of familial expectations that individuals carried with them into the stressful environment of the courtroom. When he was officially assigned to provide critical security detail at the High Court, his vital role was vastly more complex than simply standing as a static, physical guard at a wooden door. He effectively functioned as a highly sensitive human barometer, constantly measuring the volatile emotional pressure slowly building within the confines of the building. He expertly watched the subtle, telling shifts in defensive body language, carefully listened to the hushed, tense, and angry conversations echoing in the marble hallways, and intuitively sensed precisely when the invisible, dangerous threshold between manageable, simmering frustration and completely uncontrollable, explosive volatility was rapidly being crossed. His mere physical presence, standing as a calm, steadfast, and authoritative figure impeccably dressed in a crisp law enforcement uniform, was very often more than enough to gently remind those completely consumed by their blinding frustration that they were currently standing in a solemn place of law, a place where civilization absolutely demanded restraint and composure. He served as the vital, living, breathing buffer standing directly between the orderly, methodical administration of justice and the unpredictable, raw, and destructive passions of human conflict. Yet, tragically and incomprehensibly, despite his vast reservoir of professional experience, his incredibly deep cultural knowledge, and his profound, undeniable personal courage, Lieutenant Brown was forced by the system to operate every single day under a staggering, almost unbelievable institutional handicap. To fully grasp the sheer, terrifying horror and the profound, systemic tragedy of exactly what happened on the afternoon of July 22, 2010, one must directly confront a specific, deeply problematic, and ultimately fatal aspect of American Samoa's legal and security framework at that specific point in time. Under the explicit, rigid laws governing the territory in the year 2010, regular, sworn police officers, including those actively conducting standard daily patrol duties and those specifically assigned to highly critical, naturally dangerous tasks like providing protective security within the highly volatile, emotionally charged environment of the High Court, were strictly, legally, and unequivocally prohibited from carrying any form of firearms. This shocking reality was not a temporary oversight, a brief logistical error, or a sudden shortage of necessary police equipment. It was a highly deliberate, long-standing, and deeply entrenched political and policy decision made by the governing authorities. The underlying rationale firmly driving this controversial policy was deeply rooted in a highly idealized, almost utopian vision of community policing, heavily influenced by the peaceful, cooperative cultural norms of the island's traditional heritage. The foundational, guiding belief of the policymakers was that in a close-knit, culturally cohesive, and deeply religious society governed by profound mutual respect and the overarching, peaceful principles of FAA Samoa, the sudden introduction of lethal weapons into routine, daily law enforcement interactions would be perceived as unnecessarily provocative, highly aggressive, and fundamentally detrimental to the sacred, essential trust established between the unarmed police force and the general public. The prevailing theoretical assumption was that the crisp uniform, the shiny badge, and the officer's inherent, culturally reinforced personal authority would perpetually serve as a completely sufficient and reliable deterrent against any potential outbreak of severe physical violence. However, this deeply philosophical approach, while perhaps arguably noble and well-intentioned in its absolute purest, most theoretical form, rested precariously on a dangerously fragile, incredibly naive, and ultimately catastrophic psychological assumption about human nature. It fatally assumed that the deeply ingrained cultural respect for authority and the fear of societal shame would always, without any exception whatsoever, completely outweigh the darkest, most primal, and most violent emotional impulses of a desperate human being. It foolishly assumed that a person who had become completely consumed by blinding, irrational rage, crippling, unbearable grief, or an overwhelming, obsessive, and singular desire for bloody vengeance would still somehow possess the mental clarity to pause, reflect, and consciously choose to honor the purely symbolic, non-lethal authority of a completely unarmed police officer standing in their path. This profoundly flawed policy systematically created a critically vulnerable law enforcement infrastructure that was entirely, desperately reliant on the continued, voluntary, and peaceful compliance of every single member of the community, offering absolutely no practical, physical, or lethal recourse whatsoever when that fragile compliance abruptly, violently, and permanently vanished in a split second. For the brave men and women serving as officers on the ground, this unarmed mandate translated daily into an immense, silent, and crushing psychological burden that they were forced to carry in secret. Every single time they bravely stepped into a potentially hostile, unpredictable domestic situation, every time they responded to a violent midnight dispute in the villages, and every single time they proudly stood guard at a highly charged, emotionally explosive, and bitterly contested criminal trial, they did so with the terrifying, constant knowledge that they were completely and entirely bereft of the ultimate, necessary tool of self-defense. They were officially expected by the state to act as the ultimate, unyielding protectors of the public peace, yet they were simultaneously, systematically, and legally denied the basic physical means to protect their own lives if that peace was suddenly and violently shattered by a determined attacker. They were forced by law to rely entirely on their calming words, their imposing physical presence, their cultural standing, and their desperate, silent hope that logic, reason, and traditional respect would always ultimately prevail over unpredictable, homicidal madness. When Lieutenant Lucilla Brown confidently walked through the heavy doors of the High Court on the fateful morning of July 22, 2010, he was undeniably and fully aware of this staggering, terrifying institutional vulnerability. He deeply knew the immense, life-altering stakes of the brutal assault trial that was finally reaching its tense conclusion that very day. He personally knew the specific families involved in the bitter dispute. He fully comprehended the deep, festering, and toxic animosity constantly brewing between them. And he possessed the professional experience to know with absolute certainty that the impending verdict, regardless of what it might be, possessed the terrifying potential to instantly ignite a devastating, completely uncontrollable, and highly destructive firestorm of human emotion. He strategically and bravely positioned himself in the main lobby of the courthouse, standing as a solitary, completely unarmed, and incredibly vulnerable guardian deliberately placed at the very fragile intersection of orderly law and chaotic human fury. He was a highly dedicated, lifelong public servant, a deeply respected community elder, and a profoundly courageous police officer. But in the strict, unforgiving eyes of the law he was solemnly sworn to perfectly uphold, he was a designated protector who had been completely, systematically stripped of his necessary armor before being sent onto the battlefield. The legal system itself had deliberately placed him in the very center, the absolute epicenter of a deeply personal, incredibly dangerous, and highly explosive community conflict, effectively asking him to completely absorb the deadly shockwaves of a grieving family's unhinged rage using nothing more than his bare hands and his commanding voice. It remains a profound, deeply disturbing, and heartbreaking tragedy that a noble man who had selflessly devoted his entire adult life to safeguarding the foundational principles of justice and protecting his fellow citizens was left so completely, institutionally, and fatally unprotected by the exact same government system he so faithfully and bravely served. The fatal, irreversible flaw that led to the impending disaster was absolutely not found in his extensive training. It was certainly not found in his unwavering personal courage, and it was undeniably not found in his deep dedication to his duty. Rather, the fatal flaw was deeply, permanently embedded in a well-meaning but ultimately naive and deadly legal mandate that completely failed to recognize the terrifying, undeniable, and brutal reality of lethal human violence. As he bravely stood his ground in those incredibly critical, desperately tense, and rapidly deteriorating moments immediately following the reading of the explosive verdict, Lieutenant Brown tragically became the living, breathing embodiment of a deeply flawed, terribly asymmetric, and ultimately fatal concept of justice, a broken system where the brave, sworn guardians of the peace are actively expected to directly confront deadly, armed peril while equipped with absolutely nothing but their personal courage and a thin cloth uniform that was never, ever designed to stop a speeding bullet. The courtroom atmosphere had evolved into a crucible of raw human emotion, a pressure vessel where the accumulated grievances of two rival families were pushed to their absolute breaking point by the relentless, grinding progress of the judicial process. Within the sterile, climate-controlled environment of the High Court, the air felt uncharacteristically heavy, as if the oxygen had been replaced by the stifling weight of unspoken threats and the palpable vibration of competing, desperate expectations. Lieutenant Lucilla Brown, standing with his back to the polished wood of the court entrance, could feel the tension shifting like tectonic plates beneath the surface of the crowd. He was a veteran of many such days, a man who had mastered the art of reading the room long before a single word was spoken, and he knew, with a sinking, intuitive certainty, that the equilibrium was shattered beyond repair. His eyes, sharp and disciplined, moved across the gallery, mapping the lines of resentment that defined the two sides. On the left sat the family of the accused, their posture stiff, their breath held in the agonizing, rhythmic anticipation of a release they had been praying for over the long, arduous months of litigation. On the right, the victim's family sat like a monolith of grief, their eyes fixed on the judge's bench with a focus that was nothing short of predatory. They were not merely waiting for a verdict. They were demanding, with every fiber of their collective being, an admission of the wrong that had haunted their household since the assault had occurred. When the judge finally uttered the two words that would serve as the catalyst for the carnage, the silence in the room became absolute, a vacuum that seemed to suck the hope out of the courtroom entirely. The verdict of not guilty was the spark that hit the powder keg. For the family of the accused, the acquittal was a sudden, dizzying ascent from the pits of despair to the peak of relief, a moment of profound vindication that caused them to exhale in a collective shudder of release. For the opposing family, the same words were a physical blow, a sudden, sharp, and agonizing rejection of their suffering. There was no transition, no pause for the legal formalities to conclude with the usual rhythmic decorum. The shift from legal procedure to visceral, primitive reaction was instantaneous. The victim's family, feeling the weight of their own perceived injustice, did not erupt into the typical, loud verbal protest that Lieutenant Brown might have successfully de-escalated with a calm word or a stern, authoritative gesture. Instead, there was a sudden, chilling stillness in their section, a collective, dangerous withdrawal that signaled the absolute abandonment of the social contract. Lieutenant Brown's training kicked in with the precision of a lifetime of service. He saw the shift in the target family's behavior. The sudden, unified rise from the benches, the lack of tears or protest, and the terrifying, focused movement toward the exits. He knew that the exit was the bottleneck where the tension would inevitably manifest as physical conflict. He moved to intercept, his hands open and visible, his demeanor a masterpiece of controlled, professional authority. He was trying to be the anchor, the steadying force that would guide these grieving, angry people away from the edge of a precipice that they were clearly prepared to leap from. But as the throngs of people began to churn toward the hallway, a singular, terrifying anomaly emerged from the chaos. Amidst the movement of grieving and relieved family members, one individual, consumed by an obsession that had long ago eclipsed all reason, began to execute a plan that had been forming in the shadows of their mind throughout the entire trial. The perpetrator, unnoticed in the surge of the crowd, had not come to the courthouse to seek justice through the law. They had come to enact their own, final, and catastrophic judgment. The movement was subtle at first, a shifting of shoulders, a reach toward a concealed pocket, a sudden, purposeful change in gait that defied the flow of the exiting crowd. Lieutenant Brown, standing as the gatekeeper to the transition between the sanctuary of the court and the vulnerability of the outside world, saw the target. He saw the glint of metal being drawn, a sight that should have been impossible in such a place, a sight that turned the entire logic of his protection duty into a hollow, meaningless farce. In that heartbeat, the officer was faced with the ultimate, brutal realization of the system's failure. He was armed with nothing. He had no sidearm to level, no ballistic shield to rely on, no barrier between his chest and the oncoming lead that was being chambered with cold, mechanical efficiency. He stood his ground, a monument to a duty that had been rendered obsolete by the very law that established it. He was not a fool. He knew exactly what was about to happen. He knew that the man approaching him was not deterred by the badge, not intimidated by the uniform, and not held back by the sanctity of the high building. The perpetrator, blinded by the perceived injustice of the acquittal, saw the officer not as a fellow human being or a representative of the law, but as the final, frustrating obstacle to their desired retribution. The first shot shattered the silence of the lobby, a sharp, concussive crack that seemed to distort the air itself. It was a sound that didn't belong in the courtroom. It was a sound of the battlefield, of the lawless, of the savage. The impact on Lieutenant Brown was sudden and absolute. He didn't have time to react, to shout a warning to the surrounding civilians, or even to process the profound betrayal of his government's policy. He simply crumpled. The force of the projectile, fired from a close range with absolute intent, took the breath from his lungs and the strength from his legs. As he fell to the polished floor of the courthouse, the chaos that he had spent his life preventing instantly exploded into a scene of primal, unadulterated terror. The crowd, previously moving with the slow, heavy rhythm of courtroom departure, now surged in a panicked, stampeding wave, screaming and pushing to escape the line of fire. The lobby, which only moments ago had been a place of order and final legal decisions, was transformed into a killing field. The shooter, however, was not finished. The death of the officer was merely the first, necessary step in their descent into total madness. Driven by the singular, delusional belief that they had been cheated by the system, the assailant turned their attention toward the other officers who were desperately attempting to restore order, to provide aid, to act as a barrier against the continuing slaughter. The scene became a grotesque, slow-motion nightmare. Every shot fired echoed off the marble walls, multiplying the sound until it seemed like the building itself was screaming. Lieutenant Brown, lying on the floor, was witnessing the final, tragic failure of his existence as an officer. He had been placed there to protect, to prevent, to manage, and a shield, but he had been stripped of the one thing that could have stopped the perpetrator before they reached the lobby. The vulnerability was not just his. It was the vulnerability of the entire police force of American Samoa, stripped bare in the most painful, public way possible. As the shooter continued to fire, the other officers, also unarmed, were forced into a desperate, improvised scramble for cover. They weren't fighting back with equal force. They were acting as human shields, diving into the line of fire to save the lives of the innocent bystanders who were trapped in the lobby. The horror was compounded by the fact that the victims were not just the officers. They were the members of the other family, the innocent relatives of the acquitted defendant who now found themselves in the crosshairs of a vengeful, homicidal maniac. The courtroom doors were jammed with people, the panic creating a crush that made escape nearly impossible. The air was thick with the smell of sulfur and the sharp, metallic tang of blood. The screams of the wounded and the terrified echoed through the halls, a discordant symphony of suffering that would haunt the village of Fagatogo for decades to come. Throughout the madness, the memory of Lieutenant Brown remained a focal point. Even in his final moments, his presence was a testament to the tragedy of the unarmed mandate. He had been a professional to the very end, his focus on the crowd, his awareness of the tension, his dedication to the rules of the court. He hadn't broken rank. He hadn't fled. He had simply been outmatched by a policy that refused to acknowledge the dark, violent potential of the human heart. The irony was suffocating. The very institution that promised to keep the people safe had, through its rigid adherence to a peaceful, non-lethal ideal, created the conditions for a massacre. The shooter, emboldened by the lack of armed resistance, moved with a terrifying confidence, stepping over the debris and the fallen, determined to finish what the verdict had denied them. It was only after the shooter had exhausted their ammunition, and after the remaining officers had managed to overcome the perpetrator through a surge of desperate, collective physical force, that the silence began to return to the hall. But it was a different kind of silence. It was a heavy, suffocating, and permanent silence that followed the loss of a pillar of the community. As the smoke cleared and the initial frantic calls for emergency medical services went out, the realization began to set in that this was not a simple criminal incident. It was a structural failure, a societal catastrophe that had been years in the making. The tragedy was not just in the loss of life, though that was immense and irreparable. The tragedy was in the realization that the system had failed its most loyal servant in the most brutal way imaginable. Lieutenant Brown was not just a victim of a crazed individual. He was a victim of a policy that had left him defenseless against the very evil he was sworn to confront. As he lay there, his life fading into the history of the island, he stood as the ultimate, tragic witness to the fatal cost of an idealistic, but ultimately impossible, dream of an unarmed peace in a world where violence still possessed the power to shatter the structures of justice. The blood on the marble floor was a permanent, irrefutable argument against the mandate that had governed his life, a silent, painful monument to the necessity of change. The courthouse, once a place of final, measured judgment, had become a site of raw, bloody, and entirely preventable ruin. The immediate aftermath of the gunfire at the High Court in Fagatogo was not a moment of clarity, but a state of absolute, sensory-overloading shock that paralyzed the entire territory. As the initial chaos subsided into a horrifying, static scene of carnage, the reality of what had occurred began to permeate the community. The investigation did not begin in a calm, controlled environment. It began amidst the blood, the frantic wailing of grieving families, and the hollow, echoing silence of a broken sanctuary. For the investigators and the remaining law enforcement personnel, the scene was a grotesque puzzle of contradictory evidence. On one hand, there was the clear, undeniable act of premeditated homicide. The perpetrator had arrived with a weapon, intending to subvert the verdict of the court through the barrel of a gun. On the other hand, there was the systemic failure that had allowed this event to reach such a level of lethality. Every piece of evidence, the spent casings, the position of the fallen, the testimonies of the shell-shocked witnesses, pointed to a truth that was as uncomfortable as it was undeniable. This was a tragedy that the current legal framework had not only failed to prevent but had, in some profound sense, facilitated. The investigative process was handled with the urgency and the weight that comes with the loss of a fellow officer, particularly one as respected and deeply entrenched in the local culture as Lieutenant Lucilla Brown. Detectives and high-ranking officials descended upon the courthouse, their movements stiff and heavy with the burden of grief. They began the tedious, systematic collection of forensic evidence, mapping the path the assailant had taken from the benches of the gallery to the lobby where the shooting took place. Each piece of physical evidence was a silent testimony to the speed and the brutality of the attack. They gathered the witness statements, but these were fragmented, clouded by the haze of extreme trauma. People spoke in hushed, trembling tones, their accounts overlapping, contradicting, and bleeding into one another. The common thread in all these testimonies was the profound sense of helplessness. Every witness recounted the same, haunting detail. The sight of Lieutenant Brown standing firmly in his post, his uniform crisp and authoritative, attempting to calm the storm with nothing but his presence, only to be cut down by the violent, sudden intrusion of lethal weaponry. As the detectives delved deeper into the background of the perpetrator, they uncovered a history of simmering, deep-seated resentment that had been allowed to fester, unchecked, beneath the surface of the social order. They investigated the accused family, the victim's family, and the history of the initial assault case that had led to the final verdict. It became clear that this was not a spontaneous outburst of madness, but a culmination of a long-standing, toxic feud that the court had failed to adequately address or contain. The investigators looked into how the firearm had been obtained, the logistics of its concealment, and the precise moment of its introduction into the courtroom. This part of the investigation was critical, as it aimed to understand how the security measures, or the lack thereof, had been bypassed. The truth was that there were no security measures to bypass. There were no metal detectors, no armed checkpoints, and no tactical response team on site. The court relied on the social expectation of compliance, a relic of a past that had been systematically erased by the encroaching reality of modern violence. The investigation also had to turn its lens inward toward the police department and the territorial government to understand how such a vulnerable security protocol had been maintained for so long. This was the most difficult, most painful aspect of the inquiry. It involved questioning the decisions of superiors, the legislative mandates that forbade the arming of officers, and the cultural justifications that had been used to defend these policies. Every time an investigator asked a question about the lack of weapons, they were forced to confront the policy that had directly led to Lieutenant Brown's death. The investigation, which was supposed to be a search for the perpetrator's motives and the truth of the incident, began to feel like an autopsy of the entire legal and security philosophy of American Samoa. The frustration among the ranks of the police force was palpable, a growing, righteous anger that could no longer be contained by the traditional codes of respect and obedience. They meticulously reconstructed the timeline of the shooting, second by agonizing second. They looked at the footage where it was available, and they analyzed the floor plan of the Fagatogo High Court, noting the lack of tactical cover, the open design of the lobby, and the absence of any protected perimeter for the court staff. The findings were consistently, depressingly the same. The environment was designed for a level of civility that no longer existed. The investigators found evidence of the intense emotional pressure that had built up within the families, a pressure that was clearly evident in the communications and the interactions leading up to the trial. They looked for red flags, for signs that this outcome had been predicted or could have been prevented. They found a history of warnings, of previous, smaller incidents, and of an increasing level of hostility that had been, perhaps, underestimated by the judicial authorities. The investigation was not just about the shooting. It was about the failure to recognize the changing nature of the community's problems. Throughout this process, the investigators had to navigate the deep, complex social landscape of the island. They had to talk to community leaders, chiefs, and family elders, acknowledging the deep-seated cultural complexities that had contributed to the feud. They were not just looking for evidence of a crime. They were trying to understand the collapse of the social fabric. This required a level of diplomatic, cultural sensitivity that was even more draining than the forensic work. They had to acknowledge the legitimacy of the family's pain while simultaneously holding the perpetrator accountable for the inexcusable, lethal choice they had made. It was a delicate, often fraught balancing act, made all the more difficult by the fact that the entire island was in a state of collective, raw mourning. The investigation into the shooter was relatively straightforward. The act was documented, the evidence was clear, and the perpetrator was identified. But the investigation into the system was, in many ways, just beginning. The role of the forensic analysts was to provide a clinical, objective account of the violence, but their findings were fundamentally, emotionally impossible to process. They noted the trajectory of the bullets, the proximity of the shooter to the victims, and the lack of any defensive stance from the officers. The data showed that the officers had been standing, waiting, and observing, essentially acting as stationary targets. The technical nature of these reports served to sharpen the tragedy, stripping away any illusions of heroism or tactical struggle. It was an execution, plain and simple, carried out in a space that was supposed to be the most secure on the island. The detectives felt the weight of every shell casing they bagged, every photograph they took, and every statement they transcribed. They were not just documenting a murder. They were documenting the end of an era of innocence for the territory. As the investigation reached its conclusion, it left behind a profound, inescapable realization. The system had been fundamentally broken. The investigation exposed the glaring, fatal disconnect between the legal, nonviolent ideals of the territorial government and the harsh, unpredictable realities of modern life. It became clear that the security protocols were not merely inadequate, they were actively dangerous. By stripping the police of their primary tool of self-defense, the government had placed its officers in a position that was morally and tactically untenable. The investigation had done more than just identify the perpetrator. It had forced the community to look in the mirror and face a version of itself that was no longer protected, no longer immune to the reach of violence, and no longer able to rely on the traditional, informal structures of order to maintain the peace. The final report was a comprehensive, damning indictment of the status quo. It detailed the failures in security, the limitations of the existing legal framework, and the critical need for a complete, immediate overhaul of police training and equipment. It was a document that would become the cornerstone for the massive legislative and societal changes that were destined to follow. But for the investigators, the report was just a piece of paper. It didn't replace the life of Lieutenant Brown, it didn't ease the trauma of the witnesses, and it didn't restore the peace of the High Court. It was merely the final, necessary step in acknowledging the scope of the tragedy, a formal, bureaucratic acknowledgement that the world in which they had lived and worked had been permanently and violently altered. The investigation, which had begun in a state of confusion and horror, had ended in a state of cold, clinical clarity, leaving the community with no choice but to confront the difficult, painful truth of their own vulnerability. It was a realization that would echo throughout the halls of the Fagatogo courthouse for years to come, a lasting, haunting reminder that when the structures of justice are left undefended, the price is paid in the lives of the very best among us. The legal aftermath of the massacre at the High Court in Fagatogo was as intense and emotionally charged as the act of violence itself, representing a definitive, historical turning point for the territory of American Samoa. Once the investigation had meticulously gathered the evidence, the judicial process moved toward the inevitable, arduous phase of trial and adjudication. The courtroom, the very same space that had been desecrated by the blood of Lieutenant Lucilla Brown and the terror of the shooting, now had to host the formal, clinical assessment of the perpetrator's guilt. The atmosphere within the building remained thick with the palpable, lingering trauma of the previous year. Every aspect of the trial was conducted under a microscope, with the eyes of the entire island nation fixed firmly on the proceedings. The community was not merely seeking a legal conviction. They were seeking a sense of closure, a formal, binding confirmation that the horrific violation of their sanctuary would be met with the full, unyielding weight of the law. The prosecution faced the monumental task of translating the visceral, chaotic horror of that day into a coherent, legal narrative that would withstand the most rigorous, aggressive scrutiny of the defense. The trial proceedings were characterized by a somber, heavy precision. Witnesses who had barely survived the ordeal were called upon to recount the most traumatic moments of their lives, forced to relive the terror, the screams, and the sight of their fallen protector in the sterile, unyielding environment of the witness stand. Their testimonies were a harrowing, essential component of the trial, grounding the legal argument in the raw, human reality of the crime. Each word uttered was a brick in the foundation of the state's case, a painful, necessary articulation of the devastation caused by the shooter's deliberate, homicidal choices. The defense, as is their fundamental, constitutional duty, explored every possible avenue to challenge the state's narrative, questioning the sequence of events, the mental state of the defendant, and the specific, tragic circumstances that had allowed the violence to unfold so rapidly. They navigated the difficult, delicate space between the objective facts of the shooting and the subjective, psychological state of their client, who had been driven by a toxic, long-festering resentment. The courtroom itself became a theater of profound, collective grief. The families involved, the relatives of the fallen Lieutenant Brown, the family of the accused who had been acquitted in the previous, fateful case, and the families of the other victims, were all forced to confront one another within the very halls where their lives had been irrevocably shattered. The judicial process, intended to be a mechanism of objective, sterile conflict resolution, felt at times like a frail, insufficient tool in the face of such deep, visceral, and intergenerational animosity. The judge, maintaining a posture of unwavering, composed authority, had to ensure that the proceedings remained governed by the rule of law, protecting the integrity of the trial against the overwhelming, surging pressure of societal outrage. Every ruling, every objection sustained or overruled, felt like it was carving out a piece of history, defining the new, hardened reality of the island's relationship with justice and safety. The evidence presented was comprehensive, clinical, and devastating. Forensic experts mapped the ballistics, placing the shooter in the precise, fatal location that had been occupied by Lieutenant Brown. The documentation of the firearm, its acquisition, its concealment, and its lethal use was laid out with absolute, undeniable clarity. The prosecution emphasized the premeditated, intentional nature of the act, countering any potential claims of heat of passion or diminished capacity. They built a case centered on accountability, arguing that the shooter, regardless of their own perceived grievances, had made the clear, catastrophic decision to bring lethal violence into the temple of the law. The jury, comprised of fellow citizens from the island community, sat with an expression of stoic, heavy responsibility. They were the ones who would have to translate the trauma of the public into the final, binding language of the law. Their role was not merely to determine guilt or innocence. It was to represent the collective, wounded conscience of a territory that had been forced to witness the ultimate failure of its own security, and to decide on the appropriate, severe consequences for the perpetrator of that failure. As the trial progressed, the focus inevitably shifted toward the structural and systemic issues that had been laid bare by the incident. While the trial was strictly focused on the individual culpability of the defendant, the context of the unarmed police force hung over every single session. The public, the witnesses, and the legal representatives were all painfully aware of the systemic deficiency that had transformed a manageable courtroom conflict into a mass casualty event. This created an implicit, constant layer of tension in the courtroom, as if the legal process was being forced to justify, in some way, the environment in which the tragedy had occurred. The prosecutor's case was as much an argument for the necessity of law and order as it was an argument against the specific, fatal policy that had left the protectors of that order defenseless. Every mention of Lieutenant Brown's lack of a weapon served to highlight the extreme, unfair imbalance of power that had existed on that day. The culmination of the trial was a moment of profound, quiet intensity. When the verdict was finally reached and the sentence was announced, it brought an end to the procedural, legal battle, but it could never truly provide a comprehensive, emotional conclusion to the disaster. The conviction of a shooter was a triumph of the legal system's ability to respond to and punish violence, yet felt hollow in the face of the permanent, irreparable damage that had been wrought. The sentencing of the perpetrator to a term of imprisonment was an act of justice, but it was an act of post facto correction for a tragedy that should never have happened in the first place. The community listened as the court pronounced the final judgment, a somber, definitive end to the immediate legal process. But the courtroom, having played its part in the adjudication of the crime, was left to reckon with the lasting, deep-seated impact of the event. The results of the trial had a profound ripple effect across the entire territory of American Samoa. It served as the official judicial finality to the most traumatic event in the history of the Fagatogo High Court. It sent a clear, uncompromising message that the intentional violation of the judicial process and the murder of a law enforcement officer would be met with the highest possible level of societal and legal sanction. The conviction was a necessary, essential step in the process of societal healing, a reassertion of the rule of law over the chaotic, primitive impulses of revenge. It reaffirmed that the courtroom, even when its authority is challenged or ignored, remains the ultimate, final arbiter of justice. Yet, the victory was tempered by the persistent, painful reality that the tragedy was fundamentally and systematically rooted in a past that had ignored the necessity of modern security. The trial proceedings also highlighted the extraordinary resilience of the witnesses and the surviving officers. Their willingness to come forward, to endure the intense scrutiny of the courtroom, and to provide the testimony necessary to secure a conviction was a testament to their dedication to the memory of Lieutenant Brown. They had been victims of the same broken system, yet they had stood up to ensure that the process of justice could, at the very least, be completed. Their actions were a silent, powerful, and effective bridge between the trauma of the past and the necessity of future change. They had been the front line against a shooter, and they were now the front line in the process of ensuring that such an incident would never be allowed to repeat itself. The aftermath of the trial left the legal landscape of American Samoa significantly altered. The precedents set, the procedures reviewed, and the lessons learned were all integrated into a broader, territory-wide reconsideration of law enforcement policies and judicial security. The tragedy had fundamentally challenged the territory's commitment to an unarmed, idealized model of policing, forcing a transition toward a more practical, safety-oriented paradigm that acknowledged the evolving nature of global and local threats. The finality of the trial verdict allowed the community to move into a phase of reflection and institutional reform, with the memory of the fallen officer serving as the primary, motivating force behind the changes. The legal process, which had struggled to contain the original conflict, had finally, albeit at a devastating cost, managed to deliver a semblance of justice, leaving the island to grapple with the painful, enduring memory of the day the law was forced to look into the abyss of its own systemic vulnerability. The trial was the conclusion of a case, but it was also the end of an illusion, a permanent transition from a fragile, idealistic past into a reality where the protection of justice is recognized as an active, and sometimes deadly, responsibility that requires the full, appropriate, and modern capacity of the state. The legacy of the tragedy at the High Court of Fagatogo in 2010 is not confined to the sterile, dusty records of a closed criminal case, nor is it merely a cautionary tale relegated to the archives of legal history. Instead, the death of Lieutenant Lucilla Brown acts as a permanent, haunting watermark in the collective consciousness of American Samoa, serving as the definitive catalyst for a profound, painful, and necessary transformation of the territory's entire law enforcement philosophy. The killing of a dedicated officer, who was left utterly defenseless by the very system he was sworn to protect, forced the government, the legislature, and the citizenry to confront the stark, uncomfortable, and irrefutable reality that their idealized, peaceful vision of society had been tragically, perhaps fatally, misaligned with the complexities of the modern world. The shadow cast by that day remains long and deep, acting as a constant, somber reminder of the human cost of institutional inertia, a reminder that the price of failing to evolve in the face of inevitable, evolving danger is paid in the lives of the most selfless and courageous members of the community. In the immediate years following the shooting, the narrative of the unarmed protector was dismantled with a clinical, almost brutal efficiency. The outcry from the police force itself and from the grieving families who had lost a protector to an act of avoidable violence became too loud and too righteous for the government to ignore. The argument for reform was not based on abstract theory or distant mainland influences, but on the visceral, bloody memory of the marble floor of the High Court, where an officer had stood his ground without a weapon and had died because of it. This prompted a legislative and policy shift that was as monumental as it was controversial. The transition from an unarmed police force to a modernized, equipped law enforcement agency was not a simple administrative change. It was a fundamental redefinition of the relationship between the state and its protectors. It represented a hard, pragmatic acknowledgement that in a society where the threat of lethal violence exists, the men and women tasked with maintaining the rule of law must be provided with the professional tools necessary to defend themselves, and by extension, the public they serve. This evolution in policy was accompanied by a much-needed and long overdue overhaul of court security protocols across the entire territory. The days of relying solely on the presence of a uniform and the social expectation of compliance were effectively ended. Metal detectors, secure perimeter controls, and specialized, armed security details became the standard, rather than the exception. These measures were not implemented out of a desire to militarize the courts or to introduce an atmosphere of suspicion and control. They were implemented as a necessary, sobering recognition that the sanctuary of justice is only as safe as the physical measures taken to protect it. The High Court in Fagatogo, once a place where the honor and trust of the community were assumed to be sufficient deterrents, became a facility that reflected a more cautious, realistic understanding of the world. Each secure entry point and every trained, armed guard now serves as a quiet, functional tribute to Lieutenant Brown, a tangible, physical manifestation of the promise that such a vulnerability will never, ever be allowed to exist again. Beyond the physical and structural changes, the tragedy sparked a deep, soul-searching dialogue about the nature of violence within the island's tight-knit communities. It forced a conversation that was perhaps long overdue regarding the toxic, festering feuds that often define the interactions between rival families. It challenged the assumption that traditional social mechanisms could always contain the pressure of historical grievances. The incident made it clear that when emotions reach a boiling point, the legal system must be capable of providing not only a fair verdict, but also a secure environment for that verdict to be delivered. The tragedy served to emphasize that justice cannot flourish in a state of chaos, and that the rule of law is only as strong as the safety of the institutions that house it. This led to a more integrated approach to law enforcement, with a focus shifted toward proactive threat assessment, enhanced conflict resolution training, and a greater emphasis on the mental and physical preparedness of officers to handle high-stress, high-threat scenarios. Yet, despite these significant, tangible reforms, the wound inflicted on that July day in 2010 never fully heals. For those who serve alongside Lieutenant Brown, for the survivors of the shooting, and for the entire community of Fagatogo, the event remains an open, persistent, and visceral memory. The sacrifice of a man who served with such unwavering dedication and personal courage becomes a permanent, guiding North Star for every new recruit entering the police academy. He is remembered not as a victim of a system, but as a martyr for the necessary, painful, and vital evolution of that system. His story is told to remind the next generation of officers that their duty is more than just a job. It is a life-altering responsibility that carries with it the real, unpredictable potential for peril. It teaches them that their uniform is not just a symbol of authority, but a badge of service that requires the utmost vigilance, the highest level of professionalism, and the continuous, unending commitment to protect the peace, no matter the circumstances. The reflection on this case also provides a unique, powerful, and deeply human perspective on the nature of justice itself. It forces one to consider that justice is not merely a set of rules, or a process of law or a decision made by a judge. It is an active, living, and often fragile thing that requires the protection and the defense of the entire community. When we allow our institutions to become vulnerable, we are essentially allowing the foundations of our collective society to crumble. The lesson of the Fagatogo High Court is that safety and justice are not two separate things. They are two sides of the same coin, entirely dependent on one another for their continued existence. A court that cannot provide a safe environment for its participants cannot provide true, effective justice. An officer who cannot defend their own life cannot defend the community. It is a harsh, uncompromising lesson, but one that is essential for the preservation of any civilized society. Looking back from the vantage point of years later, the tragedy appears as a defining, sorrowful moment of lost innocence for the territory of American Samoa. It was the moment when the community was forced to step out of a protective, idealized past and enter into a more complex, demanding, and dangerous present. It was a transition that was as inevitable as it was tragic, a forced maturation of the legal and social order that had been long postponed by the comfort of traditional, nonviolent expectations. The memory of Lieutenant Brown stands as a bridge across that transition, a figure who represents both the best of the old, peaceful, and trust-based order and the essential, modern necessity of vigilance, preparedness, and the firm, unyielding capacity for self-defense. He is a reminder that even in a world that is becoming increasingly volatile, the commitment to the rule of law remains the most vital, the most enduring, and the most precious value of all. Ultimately, the long-term and lasting reflection on this case is one of both profound and abiding gratitude for the sacrifice of the few and a firm, ongoing commitment to the protection of the many. The story of the Fagatogo High Court shooting is, in its essence, a story of the resilience of a community that, when faced with an unimaginable horror and a fundamental failure of its own systems, chose to learn, to grow, and to act. It is a story of a territory that refused to be defined by the violence of that day, but instead used the memory of that day to build a safer, more resilient, and more enduring foundation for its future. The legacy of Lieutenant Brown lives on in every secure courtroom, in every well-trained and appropriately equipped officer, and in every quiet, determined, and resilient citizen who continues to believe in the enduring, essential promise of the law. His sacrifice, though a tragedy of the highest, most personal, and most unforgivable magnitude, has ensured that the Temple of Justice in Fagatogo stands today not just as a symbol of authority, but as a monument to the necessity of constant, unwavering, and empowered protection. He is the guardian who, in his final, ultimate act of duty, provided the community with the harsh and necessary enlightenment that forever changed the way they protect, the way they serve, and the way they honor the foundational, sacred principles of justice. His life and his sacrifice remain a powerful, enduring, and essential part of the soul of American Samoa, a testament to the belief that even in the face of the darkest, most senseless violence, the commitment to a safer, more just, and more secure future is a goal worth the struggle, a goal that can be achieved, and a goal that must be protected at all costs for every generation to come. The courtroom is now, and will always be, a place of peace, but it is a peace that is earned, secured, and constantly, diligently, and proudly defended by those who stand in the shadow of his memory, eternally reminded of the day that justice had to learn how to arm itself against the darkness. The narrative of the 2010 Fagatogo High Court shooting does not conclude with the finality of legislative reform or the solemn marking of the tragedy's anniversary. It continues to live in the nuanced, evolving character of the American Samoa community itself. As time moves forward, the memory of Lieutenant Lucilla Brown serves as a foundational element in the ongoing conversation about what it means to be a modern society that deeply cherishes its traditional roots, while simultaneously grappling with the harsh realities of the contemporary world. This ongoing process of reflection is not merely academic or procedural. It is deeply personal for every individual who witnessed the events of that July day, as well as for the subsequent generations of law enforcement officers who now walk the halls of the courthouse under a different set of protocols and with a fundamentally different understanding of their role as guardians of the law. The courthouse today stands as a monument to resilience, where the quiet, steady hum of legal proceedings is protected by a level of vigilance that was once unimagined, yet entirely necessary. This transition into a more vigilant era has not come without its own, unique, and often difficult set of challenges. Culturally, there is an enduring tension between the traditional, familial warmth of island life, which relies on open, trusting, and informal social interactions, and a modern necessity of the secure, screened, and regulated environment that now defines public spaces. Balancing these two worlds requires a sophisticated, delicate approach to policing that avoids the trap of excessive, alienating authoritarianism, while ensuring that the hard-won lessons of 2010 are never discarded in favor of a comfortable, but ultimately dangerous, complacency. The officers who serve today carry the weight of this balance on their shoulders. They are trained to be approachable, respectful, and culturally attuned, yet they remain permanently ready to respond to the potential for sudden, lethal violence. This duality is the new, defining standard of public service in the territory, a model that honors the spirit of community that Lieutenant Brown so faithfully represented while providing the physical, tactical capacity to ensure that such a tragedy remains an isolated, anomalous event. The human element of this ongoing narrative is perhaps its most vital and, at times, its most heart-wrenching component. For the families directly impacted by the shooting, the passage of time does not erase the trauma or the sense of loss. It merely changes the nature of the grief, folding it into the daily, lived experience of survival. These families, having weathered the initial firestorm of the incident and the grueling, subsequent legal battles, have become quiet, resilient pillars of the community. Their experiences have contributed to a broader, more empathetic understanding of the consequences of violence, influencing how the community approaches issues of conflict, mediation, and the support of victims. The tragedy has catalyzed a more robust network of support services, both within the police force and the wider society, recognizing that the long-term mental and emotional health of a community is as critical to its stability as its legal and security infrastructure. This collective, inward turn toward healing and awareness is a powerful, understated, and enduring response to the events of 2010, demonstrating a capacity for growth that transcends the initial, destructive act of the shooter. Furthermore, the academic and professional study of the 2010 incident has reached far beyond the shores of American Samoa, offering critical, sobering insights to law enforcement agencies and policy experts worldwide regarding the dangers of systemic, administrative vulnerability. The case is frequently analyzed in training programs, security conferences, and legal workshops, serving as a quintessential example of how well-intentioned, ideological policies can inadvertently create fatal, structural flaws in the protection of justice. It serves as a stark, empirical argument for the necessity of holistic, reality-based, and adaptable security measures. By dissecting the fatal asymmetry of the encounter, a trained professional officer against an armed assailant in an unprotected environment, experts emphasize that the failure was not in the officer's capability, but in the institutional parameters that defined his work. This global awareness of the case ensures that the memory of Lieutenant Brown contributes, in a direct and practical way, to the safety of law enforcement personnel and court participants in diverse, challenging settings across the globe. In the broader context of the Pacific, the tragedy has also influenced the ongoing regional dialogue about the intersection of tradition and modern statehood. It highlights the inherent and sometimes volatile difficulties of superimposing modern legal structures onto societies where ancient, familial ties and cultural codes of conduct remain the primary governing force. It has prompted a more considered, thoughtful approach to the development of legal institutions, one that seeks to integrate cultural sensitivity with the rigorous, mandatory protections of the state. This is an ongoing, evolving project, one that requires a constant, active engagement with the community to ensure that the institutions designed to serve them are also, in every practical sense, designed to protect them. The lesson learned in Fagatogo is that an institution cannot be truly legitimate or effective if it cannot guarantee the physical safety of those who participate in its processes, and that the only way to achieve such security is through a transparent, honest, and proactive engagement with the realities of the modern world. The image of Lieutenant Brown, preserved in photographs and in the collective, living memory of the community, remains an iconic representation of duty and service. He is remembered not as a static figure of the past, but as a dynamic, inspirational presence for the future. His sacrifice serves as a standard against which the performance and the ethics of the police force are measured. It is a standard of profound, self-sacrificing dedication that challenges every officer to maintain the highest levels of integrity, professionalism, and courage. The narrative of his life and death is transmitted through the ranks of the police force, ensuring that the lessons of the past are not lost to the passage of time or the turnover of personnel. It is a form of institutional and cultural memory that acts as a vital, stabilizing force, preventing the department from drifting back into the dangerous complacency of the pre-2010 era. The ongoing, quiet, and determined work of maintaining this memory is a collective responsibility shared by the government, the law enforcement agency, and the citizens themselves. It is reflected in the way the community treats its officers, in the way the legislature allocates resources for public safety, and in the way the judicial system approaches its most complex and volatile cases. It is a comprehensive, societal commitment to the preservation of peace through the intelligent, prepared, and active defense of justice. Every successful, orderly, and fair resolution of a high-stakes case in the High Court is a quiet, profound testament to the progress that has been made and a validation of the necessity of the changes that were forced upon the system by the tragedy. The courthouse, once a scene of darkness, is now a place where the light of legal order is protected, sustained, and upheld by a system that has been, through the fires of adversity, truly and effectively tested. Looking toward the future, the legacy of the Fagatogo High Court shooting will continue to inform the trajectory of American Samoa's development as a secure, law-abiding, and resilient territory. The challenges of the future will undoubtedly be different, shaped by evolving technologies, shifting demographics, and the unpredictable, changing nature of global and local threats. But the foundational principles established in the aftermath of the 2010 disaster remain fixed. These principles, the necessity of vigilance, the requirement of appropriate, effective tools for protection, and the imperative of institutional adaptability, are the bedrock upon which the future safety and stability of the territory will be constructed. The memory of Lieutenant Brown will remain a steady and constant companion in this journey, a reminder of the fragility of peace and the essential, and sometimes heavy, cost of maintaining it in a world where the structures of justice are constantly under the threat of being tested by the darkest, most irrational impulses of the human heart. The story of the Fagatogo High Court shooting is ultimately a story of transformation, a process by which a devastating, preventable tragedy is distilled into a source of enduring, institutional, and societal strength. It is a testament to the fact that while we cannot always prevent the emergence of violence or the individual, homicidal intent of those who seek to destroy the peace, we can and must prevent the systemic failures that allow such individuals to achieve their lethal, destructive objectives. The legacy of 2010 is not one of perpetual sorrow, but one of resolute, informed, and empowered action. It is the story of a community that, in the face of the ultimate, shattering loss of one of its finest protectors, stood up, looked the reality of its own vulnerability directly in the eye, and chose to build a future where such a loss would never be repeated. It is a future defined by the unwavering, steadfast protection of the law, a future where the sacrifice of Lieutenant Lucilla Brown is honored not just by words, but by the tangible, enduring, and uncompromising safety of every person who walks through the doors of the High Court, in the clear, hopeful knowledge that they are secure, that they are protected, and that they are standing in a temple of justice that is finally and permanently worthy of the sacrifice that secured its safety. This is the ultimate, final chapter of the tragedy, not the act of violence itself, but the long, persistent, and successful struggle to ensure that such an act never again defines the people, the place, or the pursuit of justice in American Samoa. The conclusion of the narrative surrounding the 2010 Fagatogo High Court tragedy is perhaps best found not in the finality of a courtroom gavel or the closing of an administrative file, but in the quiet, enduring resilience of the American Samoa community as it navigates the decades following such a defining rupture. To speak of this event is to acknowledge that there is a profound, indelible before and after that separates the timeline of the territory's judicial history. Before July 22, 2010, the High Court stood as an emblem of a cultural idealism where the inherent ancestral respect for authority and the familial bonds of the island were viewed as the primary bulwarks against chaos. After that day, those same walls became the site of a necessary, sobering maturity, marking the transition into an era where the protection of justice is no longer a symbolic abstraction, but a functional, tactical, and uncompromising reality. This shift represents the most significant, long-term impact of the tragedy, acting as a permanent, structural modification to the territory's societal consciousness that continues to shape the daily operations of its institutions. Reflecting on a legacy of Lieutenant Lucilla Brown involves recognizing that his sacrifice did not merely change the equipment in the lockers of the police force. It fundamentally altered the psychological posture of those who wear the badge. Modern officers in American Samoa serve with an acute, integrated awareness that the professional duty of protection carries with it an unpredictable, lethal potential that must be met with rigorous preparation and an uncompromising commitment to tactical excellence. This is not to say that the community has lost its warmth, its deeply rooted cultural values, or its spirit of mutual support. Rather, it has matured, developing a dual identity where the softness of the Pacific Island life is guarded by a hard, firm, and capable shield of modern security. The officers of today are the beneficiaries of a painful, historical lesson, and they carry that burden with a quiet, professional pride, understanding that their readiness is the direct, intended antidote to the vulnerability that once caused such devastation. In the hallways of the High Court, the atmosphere is now characterized by a palpable, structured vigilance that provides a sense of security to judges, lawyers, witnesses, and the public alike. This sense of security is not an atmosphere of oppression. It is an atmosphere of order. It communicates to everyone entering the building that the court is a place where the law is not just proclaimed, but actively, physically, and securely defended. This transition has allowed the judicial process to reclaim its sanctity, providing a space where the heavy, emotionally volatile business of legal dispute can be conducted without the looming, existential fear of sudden, extrajudicial violence. The community has come to value these security measures as essential, not as an intrusion, but as a necessary, protective infrastructure that ensures the continued, unhindered operation of their democratic processes. The very act of passing through a secure checkpoint, of seeing a well-trained officer on duty, has become a rhythmic, reaffirming part of the civic experience, a daily tribute to the realization that peace is a fragile commodity that must be actively and perpetually maintained. The broader lesson for the global legal and law enforcement community, extracted from the Fagatogo experience, is the absolute necessity of aligning operational policies with the undeniable reality of human violence. The tragedy serves as a perennial case study in the danger of allowing ideological, nonviolent policies to become detached from the operational necessities of public safety. It warns of the catastrophic risks when institutional mandates are based on a utopian, best-case scenario of human behavior rather than the empirical, observed reality of unpredictable criminal intent. By studying the specifics of what transpired at the High Court, experts are reminded that the defense of justice is a comprehensive, holistic enterprise that includes everything from forensic preparation and tactical training to the physical design of courthouses and the logistical deployment of security assets. It is a lesson in humility for policymakers, a reminder that the failure to adequately equip those on the front lines of law enforcement is, in itself, a form of institutional and potentially lethal negligence. Within the heart of the American Samoan community, the remembrance of the event has evolved into a quiet, steadfast, and deeply held tradition of honor. Every year, as the date of the shooting approaches, there's a collective, somber recognition of the man who stood in the lobby and refused to break rank, even as he faced the inevitable. His legacy is not one of victimhood, but one of resolute, professional, and personal heroism. He is remembered as a man who understood his duty in its most absolute sense, and who performed that duty with an integrity that transcends the failures of the policy that had left him exposed. This remembrance is passed down through generations, serving as an anchor for the community's shared modern history. It is a point of reference that keeps the community grounded, ensuring that they do not drift back into the comfortable but ultimately dangerous illusions of the past. It is a story that binds the community together, providing a shared understanding of the cost of peace and the essential, and sometimes heavy, price of its preservation. The transformation of the local law enforcement agency has been nothing short of systemic and revolutionary. The agency today is characterized by its rigorous, modernized training programs, its focus on community integration, and its professionalized approach to high-stakes, security-sensitive environments. The transformation was not instantaneous, nor was it without significant internal debate, but it was sustained by the overarching, collective desire to ensure that the tragedy of 2010 would never be repeated. The officers who graduate from the academy today do so with a profound, foundational knowledge of the High Court shooting, a knowledge that defines their professional identity and underscores the importance of their role. They are not just law enforcement agents. They are the modern, equipped successors to a tradition of service that has been tested in the crucible of real-world violence and, as a result, has been forged into something stronger, more capable, and more effectively designed for the realities of the modern age. Furthermore, the judiciary itself has undergone a parallel, important evolution. The High Court, in its administrative and judicial practices, has developed a more proactive, sensitive, and secure approach to managing high-profile, volatile cases. The judges, clerks, and support staff operate within a framework that recognizes the risks inherent in the judicial process and takes measured, deliberate steps to mitigate those risks through effective, coordinated, and professional security management. The court has become an institution that is actively involved in its own protection, maintaining a collaborative and highly effective partnership with the police force. This integration of the judiciary and law enforcement, centered around the common goal of ensuring a safe and fair trial process, is the ultimate practical achievement that has emerged from the ashes of the tragedy. The story of the 2010 shooting at the Fagatogo High Court is, in the final analysis, a testament to the capacity for difficult and fundamental growth in the face of absolute, overwhelming adversity. It is a story of how a society, deeply scarred by a preventable failure, was able to channel its grief and its anger into a constructive, enduring, and effective reform of its most vital, foundational institutions. It is a story of how the rule of law was not abandoned, but rather was defended, strengthened, and ultimately preserved through the direct, tactical, and institutional responses of the community. The legacy of Lieutenant Lucilla Brown is thus preserved not just in memory, but in the reality of a territory that is today more aware, more prepared, and more deeply committed to the protection of its citizens, its institutions, and its essential cultural and legal values. The High Court stands as a place of judgment, yes, but it also stands as a testament to the resilience of a people who, having walked through the valley of shadow, have emerged on the other side with a clearer, more profound, and more actionable understanding of the fragile, essential, and above all, protected nature of the peace that they have worked so hard to build and sustain. This narrative, concluding as it does with the image of a stronger, safer, and more deliberate society, offers a message of profound, lasting hope. That even in the face of the darkest, most irrational, and most destructive impulses of humanity, there exists the strength to learn, the capacity to reform, and the enduring will to protect the sanctity of the law and the brave, selfless individuals who stand watchfully and securely at its gates. The final, expansive reflection upon the tragedy at the High Court in Fagatogo must necessarily touch upon the quiet, intangible transformations that have occurred within the human landscape of American Samoa. Beyond the legislative mandates, the tactical re-equipping of the police force, and the physical fortification of the courthouse, there exists a subtle, pervasive change in how the community perceives the concept of justice itself. For many residents, the memory of July 22, 2010 is not merely a historical marker. It is an intimate touchstone of their collective maturation. It represents the loss of a certain pastoral innocence, the belief that the sanctity of their local institutions was, in and of itself, a sufficient barrier against the darker, more turbulent currents of the outside world. This maturation has been a slow, often painful process, yet it has endowed the island with a form of wisdom that is born of direct, searing experience rather than theoretical learning. The community now understands that justice is a delicate, living organism that requires active, constant, and sometimes costly maintenance to flourish. This profound realization has rippled through the fabric of daily life in Fagatogo and beyond, influencing how families approach their own internal conflicts and how they interact with the broader apparatus of the state. There is a newfound respect for the professionalism of the justice system, a recognition that the people who occupy the offices of the court, the police station, and the prosecutor's chambers are engaged in a task of immense, and sometimes dangerous, gravity. The tragedy bridged the gap between the average citizen and the symbols of authority. It humanized the uniform of Lieutenant Brown, transforming him from a mere representative of the law into a deeply mourned, personal hero whose loss was felt in every household on the island. This shift in perception has fostered a more collaborative, informed relationship between the public and the authorities, a shift that is essential for the ongoing stability of the territory. It is no longer a system where the citizens look to the authorities to magically and silently maintain the peace. It is a system where the citizens acknowledge their own stake in that peace, understanding that the rule of law is a collective, democratic achievement that must be defended by the community as a whole. The enduring nature of this lesson is evident in the way the youth of American Samoa are now mentored, educated, and prepared for their roles in a modern, complex society. The story of the shooting, while handled with the sensitivity and gravity it deserves, is not buried or whispered in fear. It is integrated into the educational and cultural framework of the island as an essential, foundational truth about the necessity of preparedness and the value of self-sacrificing service. The youth are taught that while their culture is one of warmth, tradition, and familial loyalty, their future is one that will require the intellectual and moral strength to navigate the challenges of a rapidly changing world. By embracing this history, the community is not discarding its past. It is intentionally and wisely building a bridge from its ancestral traditions to the realities of the modern age. This conscious, reflective approach ensures that the resilience of the island is not just a reactive state, but a proactive and sustainable way of being. Furthermore, the architectural and aesthetic changes to the High Court represent more than just physical security enhancements. They are a symbolic and deeply meaningful assertion of the resilience of the legal process. The building, having been the site of such profound, irrecoverable violence, has been reclaimed as a space of dignity, reflection, and unwavering legal order. The very act of standing in the lobby today, under the watchful, professional gaze of security personnel, feels different than it did in the years prior to 2010. There's a quiet, deliberate sense of purpose that permeates the space, a realization that the structure itself has been tempered by the experience of its own vulnerability. This transformation is a testament to the fact that while violence can desecrate a space, it cannot permanently destroy the spirit of justice that the space is intended to contain. The High Court remains the beating heart of the legal community, but it now beats with a stronger, more disciplined, and more protective rhythm, one that is fully aware of its own fragility and therefore, paradoxically, more robust in its commitment to the rule of law. The international community, and specifically the wider Pacific region, often looks to the example of American Samoa's institutional reform as a model for how small, tight-knit societies can adapt to the pressures of modernity without sacrificing the essential elements of their cultural identity. The case is cited as a seminal example of principled adaptation, a process of evolution that acknowledges the necessity of change while remaining firmly rooted in the core values of the society. It serves as a powerful, persuasive case against the idea that tradition and modernity are inherently and irreconcilably opposed. Instead, it suggests that when a society is honest about its own challenges, and when it is prepared to make the difficult, foundational shifts necessary to ensure the safety and the dignity of its people, it can create a model of justice that is both culturally authentic and tactically effective. This, in many ways, is the most profound and perhaps unexpected gift that the sacrifice of Lieutenant Brown has given to the wider world. In the final, lingering moments of considering this tragedy, one cannot help but be struck by the sheer, overwhelming humanity of the entire experience. It is a story of a single, heroic individual caught in the crosshairs of an impossible, systemic conflict who acted with a clarity and a grace that even the most advanced professional training could not necessarily guarantee. Lieutenant Brown's final act was not a technical execution of manual. It was an act of profound, personal, and selfless commitment. He did not run. He did not abandon his post. And he did not falter, even when the reality of his own lack of defense must have been crystal clear to him. He was the anchor of his community in the most terrifying of moments. And his legacy is that the community, in turn, found the strength to anchor itself in the principles he so bravely embodied. His story reminds us that at the heart of every great systemic transformation, there's a human element that is fragile, precious, and ultimately the reason for all our efforts. As we look across the expanse of the Pacific, from the shores of Fagatogo to the furthest reaches of the globe, the lessons of the Fagatogo High Court continue to resonate with an unwavering, clear, and essential voice. The quest for justice is never finished. It is a permanent, ongoing, and vital task that requires the best, the most dedicated, and the most courageous among us to stand at the gates and hold the line. It is a task that must be supported by institutions that are honest, capable, and fundamentally aligned with the reality of the world in which we live. And above all, it is a task that must be fueled by the collective, enduring, and resilient memory of those who have made the ultimate, selfless sacrifice to ensure that the peace, the order, and the essential, foundational promise of the law are kept safe for everyone. The tragedy of 2010 will forever remain a part of the identity of American Samoa, but it is a part that has been transformed from a source of absolute, debilitating sorrow into a source of enduring, unwavering, and empowered strength. It is the story of a community that, when faced with the absolute, darkest possible reality of human violence, chose to look forward, chose to learn, and chose, above all else, to stand tall and carry the weight of its own future with a clarity and a dignity that will echo for generations to come. The legacy of the High Court and the memory of Lieutenant Lucilla Brown are thus secured not in the archives of history, but in the living, breathing, and protected reality of a society that has, at long last, understood the true, high, and noble cost of the peace it so deeply and so rightfully cherishes. This is the conclusion of our narrative, a journey from a fragile, idealistic past into a robust, protected, and clear-eyed future, defined by the courage of one man and the resilience of a people who have proven, through the most difficult of circumstances, that they are and will always be worthy of a justice they so determinately serve. The doors of the courthouse remain open, not just to the administration of the law, but to the continued, enduring promise that here, in this place, the law is protected, the people are safe, and the sacrifice of the past is honored by the vigilance and the integrity of the present. The echo of the gunfire has faded, but the sound of progress, the steady, rhythmic, and purposeful progress of a community that has found its strength in the face of tragedy, remains, serving as a beacon of hope and a monument to the enduring human capacity for survival, for change, and for the tireless, essential, and noble pursuit of a justice that is secure, fair, and truly reflective of the values we hold most dear. The final assessment of the tragedy at the Fagatogo High Court on July 22, 2010, requires a synthesis of all the historical, structural, and emotional threads that we have carefully unraveled throughout this narrative. It serves as an ultimate reflection on the fragility of human institutions and the immense, often brutal cost of institutional evolution. When we contemplate the life and the ultimate death of Lieutenant Lucilla Brown, we are not merely considering the loss of a public servant. We are contemplating the collapse of a specific worldview, an idealized, Pacific-centered philosophy of order that sought to minimize the influence of coercive, armed authority in favor of community cohesion and mutual respect. This philosophy, while deeply rooted in the noble, traditional values of Fa Samoa, was found to be tragically insufficient when confronted with the raw, nihilistic violence of a single individual who had broken from the collective social contract. The lesson of this event is therefore universal. The preservation of justice within a societal framework is not merely an exercise in maintaining moral order, but an operational imperative that requires the tangible, physical capacity to repel violence when the orderly mechanisms of law fail to contain it. This final chapter must acknowledge that the reform of the American Samoa police force and the subsequent fortification of the High Court were not acts of concession to an outside, aggressive influence, but acts of necessary, localized maturity. The transition was driven from within by the grieving colleagues of Lieutenant Brown and the families who recognized that their community's safety could no longer be left to chance or to the fading efficacy of purely cultural deterrence. It was a realization that true sovereignty and the true ability to govern oneself as a peaceful, lawful territory depends fundamentally on the state's ability to defend the very institutions that define its governance. By accepting this responsibility, American Samoa did not abandon its heritage. Rather, it reinforced it, ensuring that the peaceful, communal spirit of the island could continue to exist under the protective, watchful aegis of a modern and prepared law enforcement structure. The memory of the officer, standing tall and unarmed until his last terrible moment, acts as the moral center of this transformation, providing the ethical weight that justifies the change. In our broader understanding of this case, we must also address the role of the courtroom as a site of both legal resolution and extreme vulnerability. For years, the High Court of American Samoa had operated under the assumption that it was a space set apart, a sanctuary where the passions of the outside world were mitigated by the solemnity of the law. The events of 2010 shattered this illusion, forcing the territory to recognize that a courthouse is not a separate, immune entity, but a building like any other, subject to the same risks and the same vulnerabilities as the streets and the neighborhoods it oversees. This shift in perspective, from seeing the court as a symbolic sanctuary to seeing it as a critical infrastructure, has been essential to the effectiveness of the reforms. It has led to a more integrated security strategy, one that treats the courthouse as a vital, operational hub that must be shielded from external threats at every level, from the perimeter of the parking lot to the benches where the judges preside. This is the hallmark of a resilient legal system, the ability to recognize its own exposure and to move quickly to mitigate it. The sociological impact of this tragedy on the island community has been as profound as the legal one. It sparked a necessary, if painful, dialogue about the nature of family feuds and the limits of traditional mediation in the face of criminal conduct. It brought to the surface the reality that even in a culture as deeply connected as that of American Samoa, there exist fissures of resentment that can be exploited by the forces of violence. The community's engagement with these issues through town halls, legislative debates, and a renewed emphasis on public education represents a sophisticated democratic response to a crisis of order. It demonstrates a society that is not willing to let its future be dictated by the darkest, most violent chapters of its past, but is instead committed to the ongoing, active labor of self-improvement and societal healing. This collective resolve is perhaps the most enduring, positive outcome of the post-2010 landscape. As we conclude this detailed examination, we must return to the figure of Lieutenant Lucilla Brown. His image, often framed in the respectful, mourning tones of his colleagues, serves as a bridge between the old order and the new. He is the bridge because he held the virtues of the old order: dignity, courage, community commitment, and cultural awareness, while suffering the direct, fatal consequences of the old order's systemic deficiencies. He occupies a singular, tragic space in the history of the territory, a space that is defined by the absolute loyalty he gave to his duty and the absolute inadequacy of the support he received from the government. The transformation of the territory since his death is, in its entirety, a monument to his service. Every improvement in training, every upgrade in equipment, and every advancement in tactical procedure is an attempt, however belated and imperfect, to ensure that the vulnerability he faced is a thing of the past. He is the silent, constant witness to the progress that has been made, an eternal guardian whose memory ensures that the vigilance of the current force never falters. Looking forward, the American Samoa law enforcement landscape is one that is increasingly characterized by professionalization, specialized training, and a deep, nuanced understanding of the high-stakes environments in which officers are deployed. The agency has become a vital, respected, and modern arm of the government, capable of holding its own in a world that is becoming more connected and more prone to the ripple effects of globalized, unpredictable criminal activity. This professionalization has not come at the expense of the agency's community roots. Rather, it has strengthened them by giving officers the confidence and the capacity to serve their community with a degree of authority and security that was previously impossible. This is the synthesis that the territory has worked so hard to achieve: the strength of a modern state, integrated with the soul of a close-knit, traditional island culture. The final, lasting takeaway from the Fagatogo High Court tragedy is a testament to the resilience of human society when faced with the absolute, darkest possible reality of human violence. It is an affirmation that while we cannot always prevent the emergence of evil, we can and must prevent the systemic failures that enable it to triumph over the structures of justice. The story of Lieutenant Brown is a story of how a community, when confronted with the ultimate, shattering loss of one of its finest, most dedicated protectors, stood up, looked at the reality of its own vulnerability, and chose to build a future where such a loss would never be repeated. It is a future defined by the unwavering, steadfast protection of the law, a future where the sacrifice of one man is honored by the tangible, enduring, and uncompromising safety of every person who walks through the doors of the High Court. In this conclusion, we recognize that the echo of the gunfire that day has long since faded into the silence of history, but the sound of progress, the steady, rhythmic, and purposeful progress of a community that has found its strength in the face of adversity, remains, serving as a beacon of hope and a monument to the enduring human capacity for survival, for change, and for the tireless, essential, and noble pursuit of a justice that is secure, fair, and truly reflective of the values we hold. Most dear, the courthouse doors remain open, not just to the administration of the law, but to the continued, enduring promise that here, in this place, the law is protected, the people are safe, and the sacrifice of the past is honored by the vigilance and the integrity of the present. This narrative, concluding as it does with the image of a stronger, safer, and more deliberate society, offers a message of profound, lasting hope. that even in the face of the darkest, most irrational, and most destructive impulses of humanity, there exists the strength to learn, the capacity to reform, and the enduring will to protect the sanctity of the law and the brave, selfless individuals who stand watchfully and securely at its gates. The legacy of the High Court and the memory of Lieutenant Lucilla Brown are thus secured not in the archives of history, but in the living, breathing, and protected reality of society that has, at long last, understood the true, high, and noble cost of the peace it so determinately serves. We leave the story here, in the present, where the High Court continues its work, a place of peace secured, of duty honored, and of justice that, finally and irrevocably, has learned how to defend itself against the darkness, standing as a beacon for all who believe that the rule of law is worth the struggle, worth the sacrifice, and ultimately, worth the vigilant, enduring, and uncompromising protection of all those who are sworn to its service. As the sun dips below the horizon, casting a long, amber glow across the rugged coastline of American Samoa, the High Court of Fagatogo stands as a silent sentinel of a reality that has been fundamentally reshaped by the echoes of the past. The journey through the history of the 2010 shooting, from the initial, suffocating shock of the incident to the rigorous investigation, the emotional trial, and the sweeping institutional reforms that followed, is more than a record of tragedy. It is an exploration of the collective evolution of a society. The tragedy, while deeply anchored in the irreversible loss of Lieutenant Lucilla Brown, serves as the cornerstone for a modern, security-conscious identity that now defines the territory. Every aspect of the current legal landscape, every training session for the police force, and every policy adjustment within the halls of justice is a resonant, functional response to the vulnerability exposed on that fateful July afternoon. The transition was not just an administrative pivot. It was a societal maturation, a painful, necessary awakening that forced the territory to reconcile its deeply cherished traditional ideals with the harsh, undeniable requirements of an unpredictable and sometimes violent modern world. The role of memory in this ongoing process of stability cannot be overstated. The Fagatogo High Court, while once a place characterized by the relative simplicity of community-based expectations, now serves as a dynamic space of awareness. For the officers who walk the halls today, the memory of Lieutenant Brown is not merely a name on a plaque or a story told in the academy. It is an internal, professional standard. It dictates their vigilance, their level of preparation, and their commitment to the safety of all who enter the court. This internal standard is perhaps the most effective, enduring safeguard that the community could have established, as it relies on the personal commitment of the protectors themselves to ensure that the environment of justice remains inviolable. The legacy of the officer who died is thus woven into the fabric of the daily operations of the law, creating a self-sustaining culture of protection that effectively guards against the return of the vulnerabilities that defined the pre-2010 era. Furthermore, the integration of technology and professionalized security infrastructure has transformed the High Court into a model of modern judicial safety within the Pacific region. The transition to armed security protocols, the implementation of rigorous entry checks, and the enhanced coordination between law enforcement and the judiciary represent a commitment to the practical, tactical demands of justice. This modernization has not been viewed as a surrender of the island's cultural identity, but rather as a necessary evolution that ensures the survival and the integrity of the institutions that protect that identity. The community's support for these measures speaks to a profound, shared understanding that the peace they enjoy is contingent upon the existence of institutions that are capable of defending themselves against any and all disruptions. It is a shared societal contract, one that acknowledges that the protection of the High Court is, in essence, the protection of the rule of law itself, and that this task requires the full, proactive, and modern capacity of the government to ensure that justice remains absolute and unchallenged. The internal transformation of the police force, moving away from a decentralized, largely reactive approach toward a professional, tactical, and mission-oriented agency has been the most significant structural accomplishment of the post-2010 period. The shift towards specialized units, the integration of modern forensic and communication technologies, and the implementation of rigorous, continuous training cycles have created a law enforcement agency that is fundamentally better suited to the complexities of current challenges. This professionalization has fostered a greater level of respect and trust between the community and the force, as residents can see and understand the concrete, necessary steps taken to ensure their safety. It has shifted the dynamic from one of reliance on passive, traditional expectations to one of active, transparent, and cooperative efforts between the police and the public. This collaborative model is a vital, essential component of the territory's modern governance, providing a stable, reliable foundation upon which other social and economic progress can be sustained. As we look deeper into the structural changes, we find that the legislative and policy frameworks have also undergone a thorough, top-to-bottom review, ensuring that no officer is ever again placed in a position where they are expected to manage lethal threats without lethal means. This policy clarity is the ultimate institutional guarantee of the reform process. It is a commitment that the government of American Samoa, in all its branches, has made to its protectors, ensuring that they are provided with the best, most effective, and most professional tools available to carry out their mandate. This clarity is an essential, foundational element of the professional identity of the modern officer, giving them the confidence and the operational mandate to handle even the most volatile situations with a necessary level of force and professional composure. The tragedy of 2010 is thus effectively neutralized by a policy framework that prioritizes the safety of the officer as a primary, non-negotiable objective, a principle that is now a bedrock of the territorial law. The judicial community itself, including judges, clerks, and administrative staff, has become a more active participant in the security and threat assessment processes. The court is no longer an isolated administrative entity. It is a collaborative, secure hub of institutional life, where every individual feels a sense of ownership and responsibility for the security of their environment. This internal, cultural shift toward collective, proactive security management is a testament to the fact that the entire institution has internalized the lessons of the tragedy and translated them into a consistent, daily commitment to safety. The courthouse of today is a place of profound order, where the weight of legal proceedings is matched by the gravity of the protective measures surrounding them, ensuring that the process of justice is never again derailed by the actions of an individual who has chosen the path of violence. This shared commitment is the ultimate practical victory over the chaos that occurred in 2010, proving that an institution can learn, adapt, and become more resilient in the face of absolute, overwhelming adversity. The legacy of the Fagatogo High Court tragedy is thus one of profound, long-term empowerment. The empowerment of a community to own its vulnerabilities, the empowerment of a law enforcement agency to professionalize its response to threat, and the empowerment of a legal system to defend the sanctity of its proceedings. It is a story of how a specific tragic moment in time was used as a lever to create a better, more secure, and more just future for an entire people. The memory of Lieutenant Brown, while always carried with a sense of solemnity and personal loss, has become a source of profound, institutional strength. He remains the standard, the reference point, and the guiding, silent partner in all the work that the police and the judiciary carry out today. Every day that passes without incident in the High Court is a quiet, ongoing testament to the effectiveness of the changes that were sparked by a sacrifice, a confirmation that the path chosen by the territory was the right, the necessary, and the most effective path forward. In the final, summing analysis of this entire complex and tragic narrative, we find that the story of the 2010 shooting is one that, while beginning with the sound of gunfire in a temple of justice, ends with the measured, purposeful progress of a society that has emerged stronger, more vigilant, and more profoundly committed to the preservation of the rule of law. It is a story of human resilience at its most essential, demonstrating that when a society is forced to confront its own breaking points, it possesses the inner, hidden capacity to rebuild, to innovate, and to forge a future that is defined by the values it holds most dear. The High Court of American Samoa today stands as a structure of brick, stone, and glass, but is also a structure of memory, of lessons learned, and of a persistent, ongoing commitment to the protection of justice. The narrative concludes with the enduring, quiet confidence of a territory that has stood its ground, looked into the abyss of its own systemic frailty, and through the strength of its will and the clarity of its purpose, has ensured that the doors of justice shall remain, always protected, respected, and secure. We leave the story here, in the present, where the High Court of Fagatogo serves not only the needs of its people, but also as a beacon of institutional endurance, reminding all who visit or study its history that the peace of a community is a fragile, precious, and essential work, and that the brave, selfless, and committed individuals who stand at its gates are the ultimate, necessary guardians of that peace. Now, and for every future generation that shall come to seek the protection, the fairness, and the absolute, unwavering integrity of the law. This final assessment is a testament to the fact that while we cannot change the past, we can, with enough dedication and with a clear-eyed commitment to progress, create a future that is worthy of the memory of those who have paved the way, and that ensures in every final sense that the rule of law remains the strongest, most enduring, and most protected promise of a civilized society.